Before Verdun, before the Somme, there was another war. A war that saw modern weapons clash with medieval thinking, that introduced railways, war photography, and battlefield nurses, but also gave us miscommunication, needless slaughter, and one of the most infamous cavalry charges in history. It was a war sparked not by territory, but by holy places, religious pride, and imperial ego. It dragged Europe's greatest empires into the mud and blood of Crimea. Most have forgotten it, but its echoes shaped everything that followed. This is the story of the Crimean War, the forgotten war that changed the world forever. Chapter 1. The Sick Man of Europe. In the mid-19th century, Europe stood like a chessboard, crowded with empires, alliances, and ambitions. But one piece, long revered and feared, now trembled under the weight of decay: the Ottoman Empire. Once the terror of Christendom, the hammer at the gates of Vienna, the caliphate of sultans who ruled from the opulence of Constantinople, was now sick. Very sick. It was not a sudden illness. The decline of the Ottomans was a slow bleeding, centuries-long process of military defeats, internal rebellions, lost provinces, and an economy in shambles. And yet, despite its frailty, the empire still held lands that others coveted: the Balkans, the Holy Land, access to the Black Sea. It was, as the Tsar of Russia famously declared, a corpse not yet buried. But Russia wasn't waiting for a funeral. It wanted to dig the grave itself. To understand why the Crimean War began, one must first understand this moment, this dangerous imbalance between an empire in decline and another rising fast. The Ottoman Empire, riddled with administrative rot and surrounded by enemies, was collapsing under its own weight. And Russia, flush with pride and growing military confidence, was stepping forward as its self-proclaimed heir to Tsar Nicholas I of Russia. The Ottoman Empire was not just weak, it was obsolete. He believed it had no right to exist in a modern, Christian-dominated Europe. The Orthodox Church, so closely tied to Russian identity, was rising in prominence. And the Tsar styled himself not just a monarch, but a protector, a defender of Eastern Orthodoxy, a ruler ordained by God to shield Christian subjects from Muslim rule. This was not merely diplomacy. It was ideology. And so, in 1853, Nicholas approached the British ambassador with a proposition, a secret understanding. He proposed that the European powers allow the Ottoman Empire to disintegrate peacefully. Its lands, he suggested, could be divided among the great powers. Controlled, absorbed, civilized. Britain, wary but curious, listened. But it did not agree. For Britain, the question wasn't just about religion. It was trade, strategy, the route to India. If Russia took control of the Bosporus and the Dardanelles, the narrow straits that linked the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, it could dominate the East. Russian warships could threaten British interests, control shipping routes, challenge the Royal Navy's supremacy, and so Britain watched closely, uncomfortably. Meanwhile, France had its own calculations. Napoleon III, nephew of the great emperor, now seated on the throne, was eager to restore French prestige. His empire was young, insecure, and hungry for recognition. The Holy Land, sacred to both Catholic and Orthodox believers, became the battleground of pride. France demanded that Catholics be given special rights to protect holy sites. Russia, of course, objected. For Nicholas, it was unacceptable, an insult to orthodoxy, to Russian dignity. The Ottomans, caught in the middle, sided with France. This decision would tip a fragile balance. It was no longer about decaying empires. Now it was about honor, about faith, about power. In July 1853, Tsar Nicholas moved. He ordered Russian troops into the Danubian principalities, modern-day Romania, then under nominal Ottoman control. It was, he claimed, a temporary occupation, a means to pressure the Ottomans. But to Europe, it looked like conquest. The Ottomans, urged on by Britain and France, resisted. In October, they declared war. The war had begun, but few yet understood what it would become. At first glance, the Ottomans were hopelessly outmatched. Russia's army was vast, battle-hardened, and better equipped. But the Ottoman forces fought fiercely along the Danube. The first major clash came at Oltenitsa in November 1853. And to the shock of many, the Ottomans repelled the Russians. It was a small victory, but it resonated across Europe. Then came the disaster that changed everything. On November 30th, 1853, the Russian Black Sea Fleet launched a sudden, brutal attack on the Ottoman navy at Sinope. The battle wasn't a fight, it was a slaughter. The Ottomans lost nearly their entire fleet. Over 3,000 sailors were killed. The harbor burned. For days, Europe was stunned. Outrage erupted in London and Paris. The Russian assault was seen not as strategy, but savagery. The newspapers called it murder. British public opinion turned. And so did policy. By March 1854, both Britain and France declared war on Russia. The Crimean War had become an international conflict. The continent now found itself at a strange crossroads. Here were three Christian powers, Britain, France, and Russia, fighting over the fate of a Muslim empire. It was an irony lost on no one. And yet, every side claimed moral righteousness. Russia fought to protect Christians. Britain fought to protect balance. France fought for prestige. And the Ottomans, cornered and bleeding, fought simply to survive. The alliances were uneasy from the start. The British and French did not fully trust one another. Their armies had not fought together since the Napoleonic Wars. Their commanders clashed in personality and pride. Logistics were poor. Supplies were mismanaged. Maps were outdated or inaccurate. The soldiers suffered before the fighting even began. But still, they marched. The center of the war would soon shift from the Danube to the Crimean Peninsula, a region on the northern coast of the Black Sea, home to Russia's mighty naval base. At Sevastopol, the Allies believed that destroying this base would cripple Russian power in the region, and so they made preparations to strike. Yet, even before the first Allied soldier set foot on Crimean soil, the consequences of the war had already begun to ripple in Russia. Conscripts were called up by the hundreds of thousands. In Britain, recruitment posters filled the streets. France mobilized with speed and aggression, eager to prove itself on the world stage. And across the empire of the Ottomans, fear spread, not just of Russian invasion, but of internal collapse. Could the empire hold together under pressure? Would vassals stay loyal? Would European aid come in time? The world watched, and as it watched, it judged. The Crimean War would be one of firsts. The first were photographed, the first covered in real time by newspapers, the first to use telegraph cables for military communication, the first to reveal, openly and brutally, how ill-prepared the modern powers truly were. For the soldiers on the ground, none of that mattered. They would face freezing winters, cholera, dysentery, rotting rations, and incompetent leadership. The enemy, often, was not the soldier across the field, but the cold, the hunger, the mud, the neglect. In the palaces of Europe, kings and ministers spoke of honor, of principle, of duty, but in the fields of the Crimea, men died for reasons they barely understood. Back in St. Petersburg, Tsar Nicholas was confident. He believed Russia would prevail, that God favored him, that the West would not endure a prolonged campaign. He called his cause holy, just, inevitable, but the West was determined. Britain had staked its empire's prestige. France had staked its emperor's legacy. And the Ottoman Empire, its very survival. The world had gambled. Now it would burn from the smoky ruins of Sinope to the muddy trenches of Sevastopol, to the candlelit wards where Florence Nightingale would soon walk quietly among the dying. The war was only beginning. It began, as all such wars do, with confidence, and it would end, as all such wars do, with loss. But here, in these opening months, in the fevered palaces and frostbitten barracks, the shape of the modern world was beginning to emerge. An empire was sick, but the disease was contagious. Chapter 2. The Cross and the Crescent. The sun rose slowly over the ancient walls of Jerusalem, a city where time breathes through stone and history lingers in every shadow. Here, in this cradle of faith, three great religions coexist, often not in peace, but in tension. By the mid-19th century, the Holy Land was not just sacred, it was contested, and in the eyes of Europe, The churches of Jerusalem had become the flashpoint for something far larger than theology. A diplomatic storm was gathering, and it began with a simple key, to a holy door. In 1852, a dispute erupted over who had the right to possess the keys to the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, the site where, by Christian tradition, Jesus Christ was born. The French, as defenders of Catholic interests, demanded control. The Russians, as guardians of Orthodox Christianity, objected. The Ottomans, in whose territory the church stood, tried to appease both sides. But the damage had been done. Pride had been bruised. And Europe was watching. This was no small disagreement. It struck at the heart of centuries-old rivalries. France, under the newly crowned Emperor Napoleon III, was eager to reassert Catholic influence in the Middle East, to restore French prestige after years of political turmoil and revolution. For him, the Holy Land offered not just spiritual symbolism, but political opportunity. Russia, led by Tsar Nicholas I, took a very different view. To the Tsar, Orthodoxy was not just a faith, it was a foundation of Russian identity, a pillar of state power. He saw himself as the legitimate protector of all Orthodox Christians within the Ottoman Empire, not just spiritually, but politically and militarily. And that claim, more than any one religious site, would ignite the road to war. But why did a quarrel over religious privileges matter so much? Because in the 19th century, religion was inseparable from empire. Churches weren't just houses of worship. They were flags planted in foreign soil. To cede control of a shrine was to admit weakness. To lose guardianship was to lose face before the eyes of the world. And in the decaying courts of the Ottoman sultans, weakness was fatal. The Ottomans, trying to navigate these treacherous waters, issued a firman, an imperial decree that granted increased privileges to the Catholics, backed by French pressure. France declared victory. But in St. Petersburg, Tsar Nicholas was furious. He viewed the decision as a betrayal, a violation of long-standing agreements that favored the Orthodox Church. For him, this was not a diplomatic oversight. It was a deliberate affront, an insult wrapped in policy, and he would not let it stand. In early 1853, the Russian Empire delivered an ultimatum to Constantinople, recognized Russia's right to protect Orthodox Christians within the Ottoman realm. Officially, it was framed as a request for guarantees, a matter of humanitarian concern. But beneath the surface, it was a grab for influence, a challenge to Ottoman sovereignty, and a signal to the rest of Europe that Russia was ready to act. The Sultan hesitated that he feared war. But he feared Russian dominance even more. The Ottomans reached out to the British. They asked for counsel and support. London responded cautiously. The British government, under Prime Minister Lord Aberdeen, did not want a war over religious shrines. But it also feared Russian ambitions in the Near East. And so, British diplomats advised the Ottomans not to give in. Not yet. Tsar Nicholas, growing impatient, sent a special envoy to Constantinople, Prince Menshikov, to negotiate in person. Menshikov arrived with a mixture of arrogance and menace. He demanded sweeping concessions, control over Orthodox churches, privileges for Russian priests, even a say in internal Ottoman religious affairs. The Ottomans resisted. Tensions escalated. In June 1853, the Sultan, under quiet encouragement from Britain and France, rejected Russia's demands. The same month, Russia mobilized. Troops marched into the Danubian principalities, Moldavia and Wallachia, territories under nominal Ottoman control, now effectively occupied by Russian forces. The message was clear. Russia would not wait for diplomacy to run its course. In Constantinople, alarm bells rang. The Sultan issued a protest. Britain and France, seeing Russia's move as a threat to the balance of power, began mobilizing their fleets. War was no longer a distant shadow. It was at the doorstep, and yet, behind all the military movements, behind the political maneuvering, the heart of the crisis remained in Jerusalem. In churches lit by candles and echoed with prayer. It was here that centuries of bitterness between Catholic and Orthodox believers had festered into petty rivalries over who could place a star on the floor, who could hold services at which hour, who could sweep a particular stair to an outsider. It seemed absurd. trivial, but to those involved, it was sacred ground. Any concession was heresy. Any compromise was defeat. And so, in this narrow world of altars and incense, imperial ambition found fertile soil. The irony, the tragic irony, was that none of the great powers truly cared about the local Christian communities in Palestine. Not really. Their concern was not the well-being of pilgrims or monks, but influence, prestige, leverage, and the people who lived in these sacred places, Armenians, Greeks, Arabs, Syriacs, were often caught in the middle of this imperial tug-of-war, with no voice of their own. As Russian troops dug in along the Danube, and British warships sailed into the Aegean. The ancient rivalry between East and West, between Orthodoxy and Catholicism, had exploded into a modern diplomatic crisis. Europe was entering a new era of warfare, but the spark that lit it came from the oldest of flames, religion. In July 1853, with Russian troops still occupying Ottoman territory, the Sultan declared war. It was not a decision made lightly. The Ottoman army was stretched thin, its resources limited. But pride and sovereignty demanded action. The first shots were fired along the Danube River. Skirmishes erupted near the fortress of Caliphate. Ottoman troops repelled Russian advances at Oltanitsa, surprising observers in Europe who expected a quick collapse. Still, no one could deny who held the upper hand. Russia had numbers. It had momentum. And in St. Petersburg, Tsar Nicholas believed that the Western powers would not interfere, that Britain and France, distracted by their own interests, would never send troops to defend a crumbling empire. He was wrong, because in London and Paris, something had shifted. The attack at Sinope, still weeks away, had not yet happened. But already, public opinion was turning. The image of Russian soldiers marching unchallenged through Ottoman lands stirred old fears, memories of Napoleonic wars, anxieties about trade routes and colonies. The newspapers fanned the flames. Politicians postured, and fleets were ordered. To prepare for war by the autumn of 1853, British and French naval squadrons had entered the Dardanelles. It was a show of force, and a signal to Russia that they would not stand idly by. The cross and the crescent, once distant emblems of two worlds, were now the banners of empire. And behind them, the great powers of Europe stood poised for battle. But it had not started with gunpowder. It had started with churches, with candles flickering beneath mosaics, with monks sweeping stone floors, with prayers whispered in Latin, in Greek and Arabic and Slavonic. It had started with rival claims to sacred ground, a claim to who would protect the tombs, the relics, the stories of salvation. And in that ancient city, where time moves slowly and blood has often been spilled, in the name of heaven, a door was locked, and a key was fought over. A key, a symbol, a spark. The world would burn because of it. Chapter 3. Tsar's Ultimatum. In the frozen palaces of St. Petersburg, beneath golden domes and icy breath, a monarch stared into the storm. Tsar Nicholas I of Russia, autocrat, orthodox defender, and iron ruler, sat atop an empire vast and trembling. The winds of Europe blew cold in 1853, and the Tsar could feel the chill not only in the air, but in his soul. To him, the world was out of balance, and it was his divine duty to set it right. Nicholas did not see himself as merely a sovereign. He believed he was chosen by God, the protector of faith and order in a chaotic world. He ruled with a vision of stability, rigid, disciplined, almost sacred. In his eyes, the Ottoman Empire was not only weak, it was unnatural. Its very survival, a Muslim empire ruling over Christian peoples, was an insult to divine law, an aberration of history that could no longer be tolerated. The Tsar's thoughts turned south, toward the Balkans, where millions of Orthodox Christians lived under Ottoman rule. To him, these were not Ottoman subjects. They were spiritual children of the Russian Church. He had long claimed the right to protect them, not only in faith, but in law. And when the Ottoman Sultan granted new privileges to the Catholics, under pressure from Napoleon III of France, Nicholas saw not compromise, but betrayal. The insult was unbearable. France, the Western Catholic power, had triumphed diplomatically. And the Orthodox Church, Nicholas's church, had been humiliated on its own sacred ground. He would not let that stand. The time had come to act, not with soldiers, not yet, but with a threat, a demand, a test of wills. In February of 1853, Tsar Nicholas summoned the British ambassador, Sir Hamilton Seymour, to his palace. The conversation that followed would echo through history. Nicholas, calm but unwavering, laid out his vision. He spoke of the Ottoman Empire as a corpse, a dying state whose time had come. He proposed a plan. When the empire fell, as it surely would, Europe must be ready. It must agree, in advance, how to divide its remains. There should be no conflict, no war, only understanding among gentlemen. That he offered Britain a tempting vision: Egypt, the Holy Land, trade routes left untouched. In return, Russia would take the Orthodox lands of the Balkans. Peace through partition, harmony through conquest. But Seymour was not persuaded. He listened carefully, diplomatically, yet behind his polite words lay deep unease. What Nicholas proposed was not order, but upheaval. And in London, when Seymour's reports arrived, the British government grew alarmed. Still, Nicholas pressed forward. In March, he dispatched a special envoy, Prince Alexander Menshikov, to Constantinople. His mission: to force the Ottoman Empire to accept a new agreement, one that would grant Russia exclusive rights to protect all Orthodox Christians within Ottoman lands. Not just spiritual authority, but political power. A protectorate in all but name. Menshikov arrived with ceremony and arrogance. He made no effort to hide Russia's strength. He brought a fleet to the mouth of the Bosporus, a not-so-subtle reminder of what lay behind his words. In the Ottoman capital, tension was palpable. The Sultan's ministers were divided. Some feared war. Others feared surrender. The British ambassador, Lord Stratford de Redcliffe, cunning, cold, and fiercely pro-Ottoman, urged resistance. He warned that Menshikov's demands were a trap. If the Ottomans agreed, they would lose control of their own empire. If they refused, war might come. Menshikov presented his demands formally in May. He insisted that the Ottomans sign a secret treaty, one that would bind them to Russia's will over Orthodox subjects. It was not a request. It was an ultimatum. The Ottomans stalled. They offered minor concessions. They tried to negotiate. But Menshikov, following orders from St. Petersburg, would not bend. Behind the scenes, Stratford worked tirelessly. He flattered the Sultan. He whispered warnings in corridors. He promised British support, carefully, cautiously, but unmistakably. And then, in June, the Sultan made his decision. He refused the Russian demands. The court of Constantinople held its breath. The streets of the city, filled with rumor, with tension, with dread, waited for the Russian response. Menshikov, humiliated, packed his things. He boarded a ship and sailed home. The ultimatum had failed. Diplomacy had collapsed, and Tsar Nicholas, upon receiving the news, did what he had always intended to do. He ordered his army to move. On July 2nd, 1853, Russian troops crossed the Pruth River and marched into the Danubian principalities, Moldavia and Wallachia. These were Ottoman territories in name, but now they were Russian in fact. Nicholas claimed it was not an invasion. He called it a temporary occupation, a measure of security, a precaution, but no one was fooled. It was a show of force, calculated, deliberate, and unmistakable. In Constantinople, outrage erupted. The Sultan, torn between fear and pride, called upon his allies. He appealed to Britain and France. He asked for fleets, for promises, for protection, and London responded. The British government, long hesitant to act, now saw no choice. Russian troops so close to the Bosporus were a threat to the entire eastern Mediterranean, to British trade, to India, to empire itself. In September, a British fleet set sail for the Dardanelles. France, eager to assert its Catholic leadership, followed. The two old rivals, Britain and France, now stood together. For Tsar Nicholas, the response was unexpected. He had believed the West would protest, but not intervene. He had misjudged their resolve. Or perhaps he had not cared. In October 1853, the Sultan formally declared war on Russia. The Ottoman army, bolstered by European encouragement, prepared to fight. Skirmishes broke out along the Danube. In one early clash at Oltenitsa, Ottoman forces surprised everyone. They pushed back the Russians. A small victory, but a sign that the war would not be so simple. Still, no one doubted where the real storm was heading: Sevastopol, the Black Sea, the Crimea. For now, the war was in its early stages. But already, the lines were being drawn. East against West, cross against Crescent, empire against empire, and behind it all, one man's belief that he, the Tsar of Russia, held a sacred duty to shape the future, by force if necessary. That the fate of millions rested not in treaties or diplomacy, but in his hands. Nicholas had made his move. The ultimatum had been issued, rejected, and answered in kind. There would be no more negotiation. No more words, only war. Chapter 4. Empire on the Brink. Autumn settled heavily over the Ottoman capital in 1853. The breeze that once carried incense and call to prayer now brought whispers of war. In the grand halls of Topkapi Palace, the Sultan's court moved like shadows, anxious, uncertain, searching for resolve in a moment that offered none. The empire stood at a crossroads, and for the first time in decades, it was about to march to war not with rebellion within, but with an empire beyond. The decision had not come swiftly nor easily. For months, the Ottoman Empire had endured humiliation by diplomacy. The Tsar's envoy, Prince Menshikov, had stormed through Constantinople like a conqueror in waiting. His demands had been clear and intolerable. Russia sought legal, permanent authority over all Orthodox Christians living under Ottoman rule. If accepted, it would place millions beyond the reach of the Sultan's laws. It would open a door that could never be closed. But the Sultan had refused. Not with pride, but with necessity. To yield was to sign away sovereignty. To resist was to gamble everything. And now, the gamble had begun. With Russian troops occupying the Danubian principalities, Moldavia and Wallachia, the empire found itself pressed against a wall. These territories, while autonomous, were Ottoman, lands in name and right. But now, tens of thousands of Russian soldiers filled their valleys and riversides. The Tsar claimed it was only temporary, that it was a protective act. But no one believed him. Not in Constantinople, not in London, not in Paris. In late October, after fruitless diplomacy and mounting pressure, the Sublime Porte, the Ottoman government, declared war on Russia. It was a bold act, a desperate act, and for many within the empire, a necessary one. That the Sultan's army was no longer what it had once been. The Janissaries were long gone, destroyed in reform. The new army, the Nizami Setted, was modern in design but untested in large-scale warfare. Uniforms had changed, drill manuals had changed, but the soul of the Ottoman military was still catching up with the world that surrounded it. Nevertheless, mobilization began. Across Anatolia, Syria, and the Balkans, orders went out. Horses were gathered, muskets distributed, cannons hauled through the mud. For the first time in decades, the Ottoman Empire was preparing for a continental war against a European superpower. The Danube frontier, that ancient border between East and West, now trembled with urgency. By November, Ottoman forces began concentrating along the river. Their objective: push the Russians back across the Pruth, out of Moldavia and Wallachia, and reclaim control of their vassal states. At Oltenitsa, a small town on the left bank of the Danube, the first serious clash of the war unfolded. It was November 4th. The Ottomans crossed the river under heavy fog, taking the Russians by surprise. A brief but intense battle followed. Gunpowder choked the morning air. Musket fire echoed across the water. And then, silenced to Europe's astonishment. The Russians fell back. Oltenitsa was a modest victory in scale, but a massive one in morale. For the Ottoman soldiers, many of whom had never faced a European army before, it was a surge of pride. And for the Russian command, it was a sign that this war would not be as swift or simple as once imagined. But if Oltenitsa raised hopes, the next move tested them. South of the Danube, at the fortress town of Redan, Ottoman commander Omar Pasha prepared a larger campaign. Born in Croatia, raised as a Christian, converted to Islam, and trained in European military schools, Omar Pasha was no ordinary general. He was sharp, pragmatic, and deeply loyal to the empire that had adopted him. He knew that the coming weeks would shape not just the course of the war, but the future of Ottoman prestige. Across the river, Russian forces dug in. Their numbers grew by the day. Supplies flowed down from Bessarabia. Fortifications rose along the banks. It was not a static occupation, it was the beginning of a siege. Russia intended to hold the principalities as leverage, or as a stepping stone to more. Further east, on the Black Sea, tensions reached a boiling point. The Ottoman navy, though outclassed by Russian firepower, patrolled its coasts with urgency. At the port of Sinope, nestled against steep cliffs and narrow harbors, a small Ottoman fleet had taken shelter. They never expected what was coming. On November 30th, 1853, the Russian Black Sea Fleet, commanded by Admiral Nakhimov, launched a devastating assault. It was swift, precise, brutal. The Battle of Sinope lasted only hours. When it was over, the Ottoman squadron had been annihilated. Ships lay in flames. Sailors drowned or burned. Over 3,000 men perished. The harbor was a floating graveyard. In Istanbul, horror turned to fury, but it was not only the Ottomans who watched. Across the continent, newspapers carried the images of destruction. The Russian attack was seen not as strategy, but slaughter. In London and Paris, public outrage exploded. The term massacre appeared in headlines. The Tsar was condemned as a tyrant. War fever, once muted, now roared. But in Constantinople, war was no fever. It was a reality, and it was tightening. Within the imperial court, ministers met. Intense silence. Each dispatch from the front was studied, debated, and weighed. Some spoke of pushing deeper into Moldavia, of driving the Russians from every inch of Ottoman land. Others warned of caution, of holding the line, of preparing for an even greater conflict if the Western powers chose not to act. But action was already on its way. British and French fleets entered the Dardanelles in December under the banner of neutrality, but with cannons aimed squarely at the horizon. Their presence was a promise. If Russia pushed further, they would respond. The Ottomans stood on the brink, but they were not alone. Still, the winter of 1853 was harsh. Snow covered the Balkans. Supply lines faltered. Disease crept through barracks and villages alike. Ottoman troops dug trenches into frozen ground. Fires were few, food scarcer. But morale, surprisingly, held in the mosques of Constantinople. Sermons spoke of defiance. In the markets, rumors of victory and betrayal mixed in equal measure. In military camps, soldiers spoke of pride, of purpose, of defending not just territory, but dignity. Because for the Ottoman Empire, this was not just another war. This was a reckoning. For decades, European observers had spoken of the empire's decline as inevitable, its collapse as only a matter of time. But now it fought back. Not perfectly, not without fear, but with resolve. It was not yet clear where the war would go. The Crimea had not yet become the center of the storm. Sevastopol was still untouched. Britain and France, though preparing, had not yet fired a shot, but the fuse had been lit. The chain of events that had begun with shrines in Jerusalem had now led to corpses in the Danube, to flames at Sinope, to war declared by a dying empire that refused to lie down. The Ottoman Empire, the sick man of Europe, was bleeding. But it was not broken, not yet. And as the snow fell over the muddy rivers and shattered ships, the world began to realize that this war would not be short, that it would not be clean, that it would reshape borders, rewrite alliances, and reveal the true cost of power in a world balanced on the edge of empire. Chapter 5. Cannons on the Danube. The Danube River, long a silent witness to the tides of empires, now thundered with the roar of cannon fire. In the autumn of 1853, the tranquil waters that had carried merchants, pilgrims, and armies for centuries bore the weight of a new and deadly conflict. Along its winding course, where forests met rolling hills, the first clashes of the Crimean War unfolded. This was not yet the grand, bloody siege of Sevastopol, but the opening salvo in a struggle that would shake the continent. The Russian army, fresh from its occupation of the Danubian principalities, Moldavia and Wallachia, was eager to solidify its hold. These lands, fertile and strategic, were the gateway to the Ottoman Empire's European domains. For the Tsar and his generals, controlling the Danube meant controlling the fate of the empire itself. Yet, the Ottomans were not idle spectators. Despite internal challenges and years of decline, their forces were determined to resist. Commanders, like Omar Pasha, a man of sharp intellect and experience, understood the stakes. This was a fight not only for territory but for survival. The first significant engagement came at Oltenitsa, a small town nestled on the river's southern bank. It was early November. The air was crisp, heavy with mist and the scent of earth. Turned by soldiers' boots, Ottoman forces, composed largely of irregulars and levies, moved cautiously but with determination. They sought to reclaim lost ground, to push Russian troops back beyond the river. And on November 4, 1853, Ottoman troops launched an assault on Russian positions. The fog hung low, muffling the sounds of marching and whispered orders. Suddenly, the calm shattered. Cannons erupted, their thunder rolling across the Danube's calm surface. Muskets cracked, and the clash of bayonets rang through the chill air. The fighting was fierce but brief. Ottoman soldiers, driven by a fierce sense of duty and the defense of their homeland, pressed forward with surprising tenacity. Russian troops, taken somewhat by surprise, found themselves on the defensive. The battle swung in favor of the Ottomans. By the end of the day, Russian forces began to withdraw. Oltenitsa was in Ottoman hands, a rare but vital victory that sent ripples across the theaters of war. Though modest in scale, this battle was a symbol. It proved that the Ottoman Empire, often dismissed as the sick man of Europe, could still bleed and fight. But the war was far from decided. As November faded into December, the fighting shifted further east along the Danube. At a small fortress named Sinope, another confrontation was brewing. Russian commanders, keen to secure their positions, fortified their camps and awaited the inevitable Ottoman response. The fortress itself was modest, walls worn by years of neglect, defenses outdated. But its location was key. Controlling Sinope meant dominating a crucial crossing point, a strategic bridgehead for further operations. Ottoman forces, reinforced and emboldened by their recent success at Oltenitsa, prepared to test the Russian hold. The days leading to the battle were tense. Soldiers huddled around campfires, swapping stories of distant homes and whispered fears of death. Officers paced in the cold, studying maps, issuing orders with clipped urgency. Then, on a gray morning in mid-December, the battle erupted. Cannon fire shook the hills. Smoke curled over the riverbanks. The sound of musket volleys blended with the cries of the wounded. For hours, men fought in frozen mud, their faces streaked with soot and sweat. Despite fierce resistance, the Ottomans found the Russian lines difficult to breach. Russian artillery, though fewer in number, was expertly placed, delivering punishing blows. Infantry charges collided with volleys, and for every yard gained, lives were lost. When the dust settled, the Russians retained control of Sinope, but not without cost. Casualties on both sides were heavy. The battle was a grim reminder that this war would demand a terrible price. News of these engagements reached capitals across Europe. In London and Paris, the reports fueled debate and alarm. In St. Petersburg, they hardened resolve. The war was no longer a distant dispute over religious privileges and influence. It was a brutal contest for power on Europe's doorstep. Meanwhile, in the villages and fields along the Danube, the human cost grew. Families were torn apart. Fields lay trampled and scorched. The river that once carried life now carried corpses and despair. The early fighting along the Danube was a microcosm of the greater conflict to come. It revealed the strengths and weaknesses of both empires, the stubborn resilience of the Ottomans and the determined ambition of the Russians. It also exposed the realities of modern warfare, the horrors of artillery, the chaos of infantry combat, and the fragile line between victory and defeat that as winter deepened, both sides prepared for a longer campaign. Reinforcements were called up. Supply lines strained under the weight of men and material. Commanders adjusted strategies, learning from each encounter. But the Danube was just the beginning. Soon, the war would spread, from these riverbanks to the rocky shores of the Crimean Peninsula, from the bustling ports to the shattered trenches of Sevastopol. The world was on the cusp of a new kind of war, one of industrial power, imperial ambition, and devastating human cost. Yet, in these early battles, amidst the smoke and the cannon's roar, the fate of nations was being forged, one hard-fought yard at a time. Chapter 6. The Massacre at Sinope. The Black Sea, vast and cold, had long been a silent witness to centuries of empire and conflict. Its waters carried merchants, fishermen, and fleets, linking empires from Constantinople to Crimea, from Russia's northern ports to the Ottoman heartlands. But in late November 1853, those waters would bear witness to a single, devastating event. A battle so swift, so brutal, that it would shock Europe, harden alliances, and mark a turning point in the Crimean War. Sinope was a quiet port town perched on the southern shore of the Black Sea. Nestled among cliffs and sheltered bays, it was the gateway to the Ottoman naval presence in the region. The Ottoman fleet stationed there was modest, a collection of frigates, corvettes, and smaller vessels. Their mission, to defend the empire's interests, to patrol the coast, to protect supply lines. They were outmatched in size and firepower by the Russian Black Sea Fleet, but their presence was a statement of defiance, a refusal to yield to Russian encroachment. For weeks, tensions had simmered. Russian commanders, under the stern leadership of Admiral Pavel Nakhimov, sought to neutralize the Ottoman naval threat. Control of the Black Sea was critical. It meant freedom of movement, supply, and the ability to strike deep into enemy territory. The Russian fleet was larger, better armed, and technologically advanced, boasting steam-powered ships equipped with the latest artillery. On the morning of November 30th, 1853, the Russian fleet moved with purpose. Thick fog hung over the bay, muffling the sounds of engines and sails. To the Ottoman sailors in Sinope, the day began like any other: routine patrols, maintenance, and the murmur of daily life. Then, without warning, the silence shattered. Russian ships emerged from the mist, their guns trained on the Ottoman fleet. The battle was relentless and merciless. Admiral Nakhimov's orders were clear: destroy the Ottoman squadron before it could escape or regroup. Cannon fire erupted, smoke billowing in dense clouds. The crack of artillery was punctuated by explosions, the splintering of wood, and the anguished cries of men. Ottoman ships, anchored and vulnerable, were battered from every side. Fires broke out, rapidly consuming wooden decks and sails. Sailors fought valiantly, manning guns, tending the wounded, and attempting desperate maneuvers to evade destruction. But the Russian attack was overwhelming. The fleet's superior firepower and tactics left little room for escape. Within hours, the harbor of Sinope had become a scene of carnage. Flames illuminated the darkening sky, casting eerie shadows over shattered masts and debris. Hundreds of Ottoman sailors perished in the blaze or drowned in the freezing waters. Ships sank, some exploding as their powder magazines ignited. It was not just a defeat. It was a massacre. News of the battle spread swiftly across Europe. Newspapers, telegraphs, and diplomats carried the grim tidings. The scale of destruction was unprecedented in the region. To the Ottoman Empire, it was a crushing blow. Their naval presence in the Black Sea was decimated in a single day. But the shockwaves reached far beyond. In London and Paris, the massacre at Sinope was met with horror and outrage. To many, it symbolized Russian aggression and barbarity, a ruthless assault on a weakened empire. Political leaders seized upon the event to justify intervention. The British and French governments, already wary of Russian expansionism, saw Sinope as proof that diplomacy had failed. Public opinion, inflamed by vivid reports and sensational headlines, demanded action. In Parliament, voices called for war. On the streets, demonstrations echoed demands for justice and defense of the Ottoman ally. For Tsar Nicholas and his commanders, the reaction was a harsh awakening. What had been viewed as a strategic strike had become a political disaster. The massacre at Sinope rallied the West against Russia and paved the way for the formal declaration of war by Britain and France. In the Ottoman Empire, the loss was devastating, not only militarily but psychologically. Morale plummeted. Yet, paradoxically, it also steeled the empire's resolve. The Sultan's government, now backed by powerful allies, prepared for a conflict that would stretch far beyond the Black Sea. The massacre at Sinope was more than a naval battle. It was a turning point, a brutal testament to the destructive power of modern warfare and the fragile balance of 19th-century geopolitics. It marked the moment when the Crimean War truly exploded onto the European stage, dragging great powers into a conflict that would reshape the continent. As the smoke cleared over Sinope's burning harbor, the world understood that the war had changed, irrevocably and forever. Chapter 7. Enter the Lions. Britain and France join in. The cold winds of late 1853 carried more than the chill of winter across the ancient continent of Europe. They bore the weight of a gathering storm, a tempest forged not in the quiet halls of diplomacy, but on the bloodied fields of empire and ambition. The Crimean War, once a regional conflict between Russia and the Ottoman Empire, was about to ignite into a broader, more dangerous confrontation. The lions of Western Europe, Britain and France, were stepping onto the stage. For decades, the balance of power in Europe had been a fragile dance, choreographed through treaties, marriages, and cautious diplomacy. The Ottoman Empire, the once mighty, sick man of Europe, was propped up, for better or worse, as a counterweight to Russian ambitions. Britain and France, imperial powers with vast colonial interests, watched nervously as Russia pressed its claims, moved troops, and challenged the status quo. But it was the massacre at Sinope, that brutal annihilation of the Ottoman fleet, that shattered the illusion of restraint. The world saw what had long been feared: Russian expansionism, unchecked and ruthless in London and Paris. The news was met with shock, horror, and a rising tide of anger. The British Parliament convened in urgent sessions. Debates raged, voices rose and fell, but the message was clear. Russia had crossed a line. The balance that kept peace, the very fabric of European stability, was at risk. Prime Minister Lord Aberdeen, despite his cautious nature, faced mounting pressure. The public demanded action. The press fanned the flames of war fever. French Emperor Napoleon III, keen to restore his nation's prestige and influence, seized the moment. He proclaimed the defense of the Ottoman Empire and the sacred duty to preserve peace in Europe. In March of 1854, the British and French governments formally declared war on Russia. This was not merely a defense of an empire in decline. It was a stand for the balance of power that had long kept Europe from tearing itself apart. The lions had entered the arena. The response in the Ottoman capital was one of cautious relief. The Sultan's empire, beleaguered and strained, found new allies in its fight for survival. British and French troops began mobilizing, warships sailed into the Black Sea, and a coalition was forged, united by fear, interest, and the shared goal of halting Russian advance. For the soldiers of Britain and France, many of whom had never faced war since the Napoleonic campaigns, this was a return to the grim realities of battle. From the docks of Portsmouth and Toulon, regiments embarked with a mix of pride, apprehension, and uncertainty. The theaters of war stretched wide. The Danube front, the Black Sea, and the Crimean Peninsula itself, soon to become a crucible of suffering and heroism, awaited in London's drawing rooms and Parisian salons. Strategies were debated, alliances confirmed, and the machinery of war set in motion. The stakes were immense. The fate of empires, the control of trade routes, and the very order of the European world as the lions roared their entrance. The course of the Crimean War changed forever. What began as a dispute over religious privileges and territorial claims had evolved into a great power conflict, one that would test the mettle of nations, redefine military tactics, and expose the harsh costs of empire. The world stood on the brink. The war had become something greater than any one empire. It was now a clash of civilizations, ambitions, and ideals, and Britain and France, proud and resolute, were ready to fight. Chapter 8. Storm over Varna. The vast plains of Bulgaria, stretching beneath the scorching summer sun of 1854, bore witness to a gathering unlike any the region had seen in decades. Near the ancient city of Varna, on the edge of the Black Sea, an immense army amassed, a coalition of British, French, and Ottoman troops preparing for the storm to come. Yet, the battle that awaited was not only against the Russian enemy across the fields. It was also a brutal struggle against the merciless forces of nature, disease, and human error. From the moment the Allied forces landed on the Bulgarian coast, the promise of swift action gave way to the grim realities of 19th-century warfare. The air was thick with heat, dust, and an invisible menace that would prove deadlier than bullets or cannonballs. Illness, cholera, dysentery, typhus, these names whispered like curses through the camps. Soldiers fell sick by the thousands, their bodies ravaged by fevers and weakness. Medical knowledge was limited, sanitation poor, and the sweltering climate only worsened the suffering. Commanders struggled to maintain order and morale amid the chaos. Logistics were a nightmare. Supplies, food, and clean water arrived sporadically, hampered by poor planning and the difficulties of transport across unfamiliar terrain. Tents were overcrowded, latrines insufficient. The soldiers, many far from home and family, faced not only the enemy but despair and uncertainty. In the shade of olive trees, under the relentless sun, men waited, waiting for orders, waiting for battle, waiting for relief. Letters home told of exhaustion and fear. The booming drums of war were drowned out by the coughs and groans of the sick. The summer of 1854 became a crucible of endurance. Amid the hardships, tension grew between Allied commanders. Differences in strategy, national pride, and communication. Failures sowed confusion. The British and French, though united by purpose, sometimes found themselves at odds over tactics and priorities. Meanwhile, Ottoman forces, weakened and wary, struggled to integrate with their allies. Yet, despite these obstacles, the armies pressed forward. Fortifications were built. Reconnaissance missions sent out. The shadow of the Russian army loomed across the horizon, a constant reminder that the worst was yet to come. The storm over Varna was more than a battle of arms. It was a test of resilience against nature's cruelty and human frailty. It exposed the limits of imperial ambition and the cost of unpreparedness. As the days dragged on, the soldiers faced not only the enemy's fire but the silent siege of sickness and disorder. For many, the campaign would be remembered less for its heroics and more for its hardships. But it was here, in these trying moments, that the spirit of the Allied forces was forged, a spirit that would carry them into the fierce battles to come on the Crimean Peninsula. The storm was gathering. The war was far from over, and in the heat and dust of Varna, the future of empires hung in the balance. Chapter 9. Crossing to Crimea. The Crimean Peninsula jutted like a rugged, gray sentinel into the cold waters of the Black Sea, a land of jagged cliffs, windswept steppes, and haunting ruins, where ancient empires had left their mark. For centuries, it had been a strategic prize, coveted by empires, a gateway to the south, and a fortress guarding the Russian heartland. But in 1854, the winds of war would bring a new chapter to its rocky shores. As spring melted the snows and warmed the sea, a great Allied fleet, composed of British, French, and Ottoman ships, gathered off the Crimean coast. For weeks, they had prepared, rehearsed, and waited, their massive armada casting long shadows over the restless waves. The soldiers aboard these vessels, weary from the hardships of the Varna camp and eager to confront the enemy, felt a mix of anticipation and dread. The time to strike had come. The Russian defenders, entrenched across Crimea, were taken by surprise. Though aware of the growing threat, they had not expected the Allies to choose this moment or this place for their landing. Their forces were stretched thin, the vastness of the peninsula working both as shield and burden. Communications faltered. Commanders debated their response. The imperial court in St. Petersburg held its breath. On September 14, 1854, the first landing began. Under the gray skies, British and French troops descended from their ships onto the narrow beaches near Eupatoria, a small town on Crimea's western shore. The surf churned around their feet as they scrambled ashore, equipment heavy, boots sinking into wet sand. The initial moments were tense, eyes scanning the cliffs, muskets ready, but opposition surprisingly light. The Russians had withdrawn, choosing to avoid direct confrontation at the beaches. Behind them, the fleet moved with precision, unloading thousands of men, horses, artillery pieces, and supplies. The scale of the operation was staggering. Tens of thousands of troops disembarked over days, filling the coastal plains with tents, camps, and the hum of preparation. For the soldiers, the landing was a baptism into a new phase of war, one where land battles would test endurance, courage, and command. Yet, beneath the surface of military maneuvering, tensions simmered. Supply lines stretched across seas and rugged terrain. Commanders from different nations juggled priorities and egos. The alliance, fragile in theory, was being forged in the crucible of necessity. Russian scouts and cavalry skirmished with Allied patrols, probing defenses, gathering intelligence. Yet the main Russian army remained concentrated near Sevastopol, preparing for the siege they knew was inevitable. Sevastopol, the jewel of the Black Sea, the fortress whose fate would decide the war. As the Allies consolidated their positions, the peninsula's rugged landscape offered both challenge and opportunity. Hills and ravines became natural defenses. Weather shifted from warm days to sudden rains, turning roads into quagmires. Disease lurked in the camps as men struggled with inadequate shelter and sanitation. But the landing had succeeded. The stage was set. The Crimean War was no longer a distant conflict fought on rivers and seas. It had come ashore, raw, brutal, and relentless. The Russians braced themselves, knowing that the battle for Crimea would be a trial by fire. The Allies, determined and united, prepared to break the stalemate and strike at the heart of imperial ambition. The crossing to Crimea was the opening act of a tragic and heroic saga, a saga of men and empires, of valor and suffering, of ambition and endurance. And in the cold winds that swept the peninsula, the fate of nations hung poised on the edge of a sword. Chapter 10. The Heights of Alma. September of 1854 dawned over the Crimean Peninsula, cloaked in a mist of anticipation and dread. The winds that swept across the jagged cliffs and rolling hills carried the heavy burden of fate, for here, at the Alma River, the first great clash between the Allied forces and the Russian defenders would unfold. It was a battle not only of muskets and cannon, but of strategy, courage, and the brutal realities of war. The Allied army, a coalition of British, French, and Ottoman troops, had marched from their landing beaches toward the Russian positions with resolve. After weeks of grueling preparation, illness, and logistical struggle, their moment had arrived. The Heights of Alma loomed above the river, a natural fortress overlooking the landscape, held firmly by Russian forces under the command of Prince Alexander Menshikov, a seasoned general with a reputation for tactical skill and unyielding determination. The Russians had prepared their defenses meticulously. Trenches carved into the hillsides, artillery emplacements entrenched behind earthworks, and infantry lines poised to repel any assault. They knew the importance of holding this ground. Failure here would mean opening the gateway to Sevastopol, the fortress city that was Russia's key to controlling the Black Sea. The stakes could not have been higher. On the morning of the battle, the Allied commanders met to finalize their plans. General Lord Raglan led the British forces, his demeanor calm but serious, aware of the challenge ahead. Marshal Canrobert commanded the French, his troops battle-hardened and disciplined. Together, they coordinated a multi-pronged assault designed to overwhelm the Russians from multiple directions. As the sun rose higher, the Allied troops advanced toward the river, crossing under the cover of artillery fire. The air was thick with smoke, dust, and the sharp scent of gunpowder. The first volleys echoed across the valley, followed by the thunder of cannons, and the rattle of musket fire. The fighting was fierce and chaotic. Russian sharpshooters took aim from their elevated positions, picking off officers and soldiers alike. The riverbanks became a scene of carnage, where the cries of the wounded mingled with the roar of battle. Allied troops pressed forward with grit and determination, scaling the heights under a hail of bullets. The French led a decisive charge on the right flank, their disciplined formations pushing the Russians back. British Highlanders, with their kilts and fierce resolve, surged up the center, engaging in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Ottoman forces, though less experienced, fought valiantly alongside their allies. After hours of intense combat, the Russian lines began to falter. Menshikov, despite his efforts to rally his men, saw his forces retreat toward the safety of Sevastopol's walls. The Allies had won a significant victory at Alma, yet the triumph was bittersweet. The victory at the Heights of Alma was not fully exploited. Command indecision, logistical challenges, and communication failures hampered the Allied advance. Instead of pressing the attack to seize Sevastopol immediately, the army paused to regroup, allowing the Russians precious time to fortify their defenses. This hesitation would have profound consequences. Sevastopol, perched on the rugged Crimean coast, would soon become the focus of a protracted and grueling siege, one of the bloodiest and most infamous in military history. The war, which many had hoped would be swift, now promised months of attrition and suffering. The soldiers who fought at Alma would remember the battle as a test of endurance and bravery, marked by valor but overshadowed by missed opportunities. Commanders would face criticism, historians would debate decisions, and the lessons of Alma would echo throughout the rest of the conflict. But for that day, on the rocky heights overlooking the Alma River, the Allied flags flew victorious. The first great battle of the Crimean War had been won. The war, however, was far from over. Chapter 11. The March on Sevastopol. The dust had barely settled on the heights of Alma, and yet the battle's echo stretched far beyond the bloodied slopes. The Allied armies, British, French, and Ottoman, now stood before the formidable walls of Sevastopol, the jewel of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, a fortress city as resilient as it was strategic. It was here that the true test of wills, endurance, and warfare would be fought. The victory at Alma had opened the path. But rather than a swift, decisive strike, what followed was marked by hesitation, confusion, and missed opportunities. The march on Sevastopol became a protracted endeavor, a grinding, weary advance under a scorching sun and across rugged terrain, where every step was met by the specter of death. General Lord Raglan and Marshal Canrobert, the Allied commanders, grappled with the enormity of the task. Coordination among diverse armies, each with different languages, cultures, and military traditions, proved a daunting challenge. Orders were delayed, strategies debated endlessly, and communication tangled in the complexities of alliance politics. Meanwhile, the Russians were not idle. Under the leadership of Prince Menshikov and the seasoned General Eduard Totleben, they threw themselves into a desperate and masterful effort to prepare the city's defenses. The men of Sevastopol worked tirelessly, digging trenches, erecting earthworks, reinforcing walls, and positioning artillery with grim determination. The city was a fortress born of stone, sweat, and resolve. Its defenses sprawled over miles of rugged coastline and rocky hills. The Russian soldiers and civilians alike understood what was at stake. Sevastopol was not just a military target, it was the heart of Russia's Black Sea power. To lose it would mean a devastating blow to the empire's prestige and control. As the Allied forces approached, the siege lines began to form. Campfires flickered across the Crimean landscape, signaling the start of a war unlike any the continent had seen in years. The soldiers faced not just the enemy but hunger, disease, and the harshness of an unforgiving land. The weeks turned into months. Artillery barges shattered the quiet nights. Mines were dug beneath walls. Assaults were launched with ferocity and bloodshed. Yet, the Russians held fast. Each inch of ground contested was paid for in sweat and blood. The siege of Sevastopol would become a defining chapter in the Crimean War. It exposed the brutal realities of 19th-century warfare, the heroism and horror, the triumph and tragedy. It revealed the limits of military planning and the enduring spirit of those who fought. For the Allies, frustration mounted. The war was dragging on, draining resources and resolve. For the Russians, every day of resistance was a victory of endurance against overwhelming odds. The march on Sevastopol was no longer a mere movement of troops. It was a grim march into the heart of a brutal and grinding siege that would test the courage, will, and humanity of all involved. Chapter 12. Hell at Balaclava. October of 1854 dawned cold and gray over the windswept plains near Balaclava, a small village nestled close to the Crimean coast. It was here that one of the most unforgettable, tragic, and heroic episodes of the Crimean War unfolded, a moment forever etched in history as the charge of the Light Brigade. On this battlefield, valor and folly collided with devastating consequence, casting a long shadow over the siege of Sevastopol and the very nature of modern warfare. The Allied forces were locked in a tense stalemate. The siege of Sevastopol dragged on, with heavy casualties, dwindling supplies, and harsh conditions wearing down soldiers on both sides. The British Army, proud and battle-hardened, sought to maintain control of the vital port of Balaclava, which served as the lifeline for men and material coming by sea. The Russians, entrenched on the surrounding heights, threatened this lifeline with constant raids and artillery bombardments. On the morning of October 25th, orders were issued that would soon spiral into disaster. The commander of the British cavalry, Lord Lucan, received a vague instruction from his superior, Lord Raglan. The order was to prevent the Russians from removing captured guns from the redoubts on the Causeway Heights, a mission vital to holding the strategic ground around Balaclava. But miscommunication would turn this mission into a calamity. Lord Lucan passed the order to his cavalry commander, Lord Cardigan, who led the Light Brigade, a force of around 600 horsemen, famed for their speed, discipline, and audacity. The charge that followed would become one of the most celebrated and sorrowful episodes in military history. With a thunderous roar, the Light Brigade surged forward, their horses pounding the earth, sabers gleaming in the bleak light. They charged down the valley, a long, exposed ride directly into a gauntlet of Russian artillery and rifle fire. On either side, Russian guns unleashed a deadly hail of shells, canister, and musket balls. The riders knew the danger but pressed on with unwavering resolve. The charge was a spectacular display of courage and discipline, a testament to the indomitable spirit of the cavalrymen. Yet, it was also a tragic mistake. The Light Brigade had been ordered to attack the wrong objective, sending them directly into a heavily defended artillery battery. As they reached the Russian guns, the cost became horrifyingly clear. Horses fell, men were cut down in volleys, and chaos erupted amid the thunder of battle. The charge, though brave, was doomed from the start. Only a fraction of the cavalry made it to the enemy lines and returned. The Valley of Death, as the charge was soon called, was strewn with bodies, shattered steeds, and the echoes of desperate valor. Back at Balaclava, the scene was one of shock and grief. Survivors of the charge limped back, bearing wounds visible and invisible. The commanders faced bitter criticism, and the public was horrified by the needless sacrifice. But amidst the tragedy, stories of heroism shone through. Men like Sergeant William Jones, who rescued a wounded officer under fire, and the steady stand of the Heavy Brigade, which repelled a Russian cavalry assault later that day, exemplified the bravery and determination of those caught in the maelstrom. The charge of the Light Brigade became a symbol of courage and calamity, of the glory and the futility of war. Poets immortalized it, generals debated it. Families mourned it. It exposed the dangers of miscommunication, the costs of command failure, and the harsh realities faced by soldiers on the front lines. Hell at Balaclava was not just a battlefield. It was a crucible where heroism and blunder were forever intertwined. It stood as a stark reminder that in war, bravery alone cannot guarantee victory, and that the human spirit, even in tragedy, can inspire generations to come as the smoke cleared over the battered fields. The charge echoed through history, a timeless testament to sacrifice, valor, and the enduring complexity of human conflict. Chapter 13. The Thin Red Line. On the wind-swept plains near Balaclava, under the looming shadow of the Crimean sky, a moment of extraordinary courage unfolded, a testament to discipline, resolve, and the unyielding spirit of the Highlanders. This moment, forever remembered as the Thin Red Line, would become a symbol not only of the British Army's grit, but of the brutal realities and stark heroism that defined the Crimean War. The year was 1854, and the siege of Sevastopol had entrenched itself into a grueling stalemate. The Allied forces, comprised of British, French, and Ottoman troops, were locked in a deadly chess game with the Russians, each side probing, attacking, and defending across the Crimean landscape. Balaclava, a key logistical hub for the Allies, stood as a vital lifeline, a connection between the armies and the supplies flowing in from the sea. On October 25th, the same day that would witness the tragic charge of the Light Brigade, the Highlanders of the 93rd Regiment found themselves in the eye of a storm. Positioned on a narrow ridge, their red tunics gleaming against the gray backdrop, these soldiers faced an impending assault by a formidable Russian cavalry force intent on breaking the Allied lines. The odds were daunting. The Highlanders stood as a single, slender line, a thin red line, stretched across the slope. There were no second lines behind them, no immediate reinforcements in sight. Their backs were exposed, and the advancing Russian cavalry numbered in the thousands, confident in their momentum and the thunder of their charge. Yet, what followed was a display of steely nerve and tactical brilliance. The Highlanders held their ground, their muskets leveled and ready. As the Russians charged, the soldiers unleashed disciplined volleys of musket fire. The crack of rifles rang out sharply through the cold air, each shot carefully aimed to disrupt the cavalry's momentum. The Russian horsemen, caught off guard by the steadfast resistance and the hail of bullets, faltered. The charge lost its ferocity as men and horses fell under the precise fire. The Highlanders' unwavering line, thin though it was, held firm, a wall of red that refused to break. This stand was not merely a display of bravery. It was a tactical masterstroke. The Highlanders' discipline and training turned the tide of the moment, halting the Russian advance and safeguarding the crucial supply lines through Balaclava. The scene was electric with tension and raw humanity. Soldiers faced death not with reckless abandon, but with calculated resolve, understanding that the survival of many hinged on their steadfastness. The silence between volleys was punctuated by the neighing of horses and the distant rumble of cannon fired as the battle subsided. The Highlanders remained unbroken. Their victory was not measured in the size of their force, but in the unyielding spirit they embodied. The thin red line became legend, a phrase that captured the essence of courage under fire, of ordinary men performing extraordinary feats in the face of overwhelming odds. News of their stand spread quickly, bolstering morale across the Allied armies and inspiring poets, historians, and military leaders alike. It became a symbol of the British fighting spirit and a testament to the sacrifices made in the crucible of war. But beyond legend, the thin red line was a reminder of the stark realities of the Crimean War. It revealed the deadly efficiency of modern weaponry, the chaos of cavalry charges against disciplined infantry, and the human cost etched into every inch of contested ground. For the Highlanders, their stand at Balaclava was both a triumph and a solemn burden. The battlefield had claimed friends and comrades, and the war was far from over. Yet, in that slender line of red, hope endured, a hope that courage and steadfastness might yet turn the tide of a bitter and brutal conflict as the sun set over the Crimean hills. The thin red line stood not just as a military formation, but as a beacon of endurance, sacrifice, and the unbreakable will of those who fought beneath its banner. Chapter 14. Fog of War. The Battle of Inkerman. The morning of November 5, 1854, dawned thick with an eerie, suffocating fog that blanketed the Crimean landscape near the small village of Inkerman. What unfolded that day would become one of the most chaotic, brutal, and decisive engagements of the Crimean War, a battle where the dense mist was more than a backdrop. It was an active participant, concealing movements, obscuring orders, and forcing men into desperate, close quarters combat. In this fog-shrouded melee, small groups of soldiers fought not only for ground but for survival, and, ultimately, for the fate of the entire campaign. The Russian High Command, eager to break the Allied siege of Sevastopol, had gathered a formidable force, tens of thousands of men, poised to launch a surprise assault on the British positions. The plan was bold, relying on the element of surprise and the cover of fog to overwhelm the defenders. What the Russians did not fully anticipate, however, was the fierce resistance and resilience of the British troops dug in on the rugged hills and rocky ravines around Inkerman. From the earliest moments, the battle devolved into a fragmented, unpredictable melee. Visibility was reduced to mere yards, and the traditional formations and grand maneuvers of battle were impossible to execute. Instead, the fighting became a brutal test of individual courage, quick thinking, and raw endurance. Small units, sometimes no larger than a handful of men, collided suddenly, bayonets flashing, muskets firing at close range, as they fought to hold or gain each inch of contested ground. Amidst the dense fog, the soundscape was surreal. The crack of rifle fire, the clang of steel, the shouted orders lost and found in the mist, and the anguished cries of the wounded and dying. Commanders struggled to communicate and coordinate, their voices swallowed by the swirling air. The terrain itself, steep, rocky, and uneven, became a deadly maze where friend and foe were often indistinguishable until mere moments before contact. One such encounter was the defense of the Sandbag Battery, where a handful of British soldiers held their ground against repeated Russian assaults. Outnumbered and outgunned, these men fought with desperate tenacity, their resolve turning the tide at critical junctures. Elsewhere, isolated groups of Highlanders, Grenadiers, and light infantry repelled attacks with bayonets and steady volleys, buying precious time for reinforcements to arrive. The battle stretched over 12 relentless hours. Casualties mounted on both sides, the fog concealing not only the enemy but the staggering human cost. Officers and privates alike faced the terrifying reality that, in this murky chaos, survival often depended on split-second decisions and the unyielding bond between comrades. For the British, the day was a crucible of endurance and heroism. Despite being heavily outnumbered and caught by surprise, their discipline and determination prevailed. Reinforcements arrived piecemeal, yet each unit added strength to the fragmented defense. The Russians, though initially successful in some advances, found themselves bogged down in a battle that was less a coordinated assault and more a series of desperate, bloody skirmishes. By nightfall, the fog began to lift, revealing the battered landscape, strewn with the fallen, scarred earth, and shattered equipment. The British held their positions. The Russian assault had been repelled, but at great cost. The Battle of Inkerman exposed the brutal realities of war in an era transitioning between Napoleonic tactics and modern combat. It highlighted how fog, terrain, and confusion could transform grand strategies into fragmented struggles for survival. It also underscored the vital importance of individual courage and small unit cohesion. In the days and weeks that followed, Inkerman was remembered as a symbol of steadfast resistance. Stories circulated of soldiers who, despite wounds and exhaustion, refused to yield, of officers rallying scattered men to form new lines, of bonds forged in the crucible of fire and smoke. Yet, Inkerman was also a somber reminder of the war's savage cost. Thousands lay dead or wounded, British, Russian, and allies alike. The fields bore silent testimony to the fierce contest of wills that had transpired within the veil of fog. The siege of Sevastopol continued, and the war dragged on. But the battle near Inkerman demonstrated that even in the most chaotic and confounding circumstances, the fate of armies and empires could be decided by the grit and determination of a few. The fog of war had tested men's mettle as never before. And through the haze of battle, the indomitable spirit of those who fought emerged, a beacon of courage in a dark and uncertain conflict. Chapter 15. Digging into Sevastopol. The Crimean winter of 1854 descended upon the siege lines, encircling Sevastopol like a relentless, chilling force, and with it came a brutal transformation in the nature of warfare. Gone were the grand charges and sweeping battles of earlier campaigns. Instead, men found themselves entrenched in a grueling contest of endurance and attrition, a war of trenches, mud, and ceaseless artillery fire. The siege deepened, not just in years, but in the very earth itself. As the Allied armies, British, French, and Ottoman, settled into their positions around Sevastopol, the landscape quickly became a labyrinth of fortifications. Soldiers toiled day and night, digging deep trenches that snaked across the rocky Crimean soil, constructing redoubts and batteries, and erecting earthworks designed to withstand the devastating power of modern artillery. The ground was torn and churned, a scarred testament to the grinding reality of siege warfare. The work was backbreaking. Men wielded shovels and pickaxes, their fingers raw and blistered, faces streaked with dirt and sweat, their bodies weighed down by the cold. And the ever-present mud. Rain and thaw turned the soil into a quagmire, swallowing boots and equipment, making movement agonizingly slow. The trenches became rivers of sludge, trenches that filled with water, and men stood knee-deep in filth as they fired their muskets through narrow openings, ever watchful for enemy counterattacks. The noise was unrelenting. Cannon thundered from both sides, shells screaming overhead and exploding with earth-shaking force. The staccato of rifle fire punctuated the heavy atmosphere, while the cries of the wounded echoed in the cold air. Days bled into nights, each marked by tension, exhaustion, and the constant threat of death. The siege demanded more than physical endurance. It required a new kind of warfare, one of patience, engineering, and grim determination. The generals and engineers on both sides adapted, learning to use trenches not just as protection, but as launching points for raids, mining operations, and artillery barges. Mines were dug beneath enemy fortifications, charged with explosives to blast breaches in walls. Communication trenches allowed the steady flow of men and supplies under the watchful eyes of snipers. Life in the trenches was a harsh education in hardship. Disease spread rapidly in the cramped, unsanitary conditions. Dysentery, typhus, and cholera claimed more lives than bullets. Food was often scarce and poorly prepared, leaving soldiers weak and malnourished. The cold seeped into bones, while the mud clung to every garment and weapon. Yet, despite the misery, moments of camaraderie and courage shone through. Men shared what little warmth and comfort they could find: letters from home, stories by flickering candlelight, the occasional stolen rest amidst the chaos. Acts of heroism and kindness punctuated the bleak days as soldiers risked their lives to rescue comrades, deliver supplies, or carry messages through enemy fire. The siege of Sevastopol was not merely a battle of arms, but a battle against time and terrain. Both sides knew that endurance could win or lose the day. The Russians, entrenched behind their formidable defenses, fought with the desperation of men defending their homeland, knowing that the city's fall would mean a catastrophic defeat. The Allies, pressing ever closer, understood that patience, perseverance, and the mastery of siegecraft were their weapons. As winter wore on, the trenches became more elaborate and extensive. Networks of tunnels and dugouts provided shelter, while artillery positions were carefully calculated to deliver devastating barrages on enemy lines. The landscape transformed into a deadly chessboard, each move measured and fraught with risk. The siege also brought innovation and the grim calculus of modern warfare into sharp relief. Engineers and commanders grappled with new technologies and tactics, while the medical services struggled to cope with the growing number of casualties. The horrors of trench life foreshadowed the brutal conflicts that would later define the battlefields of the 20th century. Digging into Sevastopol was a slow, agonizing process. a testament to the endurance of soldiers caught in the grinding machinery of war. It was a war of attrition where every inch of earth contested came at a terrible cost. But it was also a war where human spirit endured, where courage persisted in the face of mud, blood, and steel. As the siege dragged into its second winter, the trenches around Sevastopol stood as silent witnesses to a conflict that reshaped not only empires, but the very nature of war itself. Chapter 16. Winter Without Mercy. The winter of 1854 to 1855 descended on the Crimean Peninsula with a merciless grip, a frozen fist that clenched around the beleaguered armies encamped outside Sevastopol. It was a season marked not only by biting cold and swirling snow, but by suffering so profound that it tested the limits of human endurance, shattered the resolve of leaders, and left scars etched deep into the memory of a war already steeped in hardship. As the icy winds howled across the bleak, snow-covered plains, the Allied forces found themselves trapped in a nightmare of nature and neglect. The promises of spring victory were lost beneath drifts of snow, and the battle for survival, against frostbite, starvation, and despair, became as fierce as the fight against the Russian enemy. Supplies faltered from the start. The vast logistics required to sustain tens of thousands of men, food, clothing, medicine, and shelter, buckled under the strain of distance, bad planning, and poor communication. The ports, vital lifelines for provisions, struggled to unload ships in the freezing weather, while supply lines stretched thin and became targets for enemy raids. In the camps, soldiers huddled in tents and makeshift shelters, ill-equipped for the brutal cold. Many wore thin uniforms unsuited for the Crimean winter. Blankets were scarce, and fires were often dampened by relentless sleet and snow. The cold seeped into bones and spirits alike, and the nights were long, dark, and filled with misery. Disease, already a constant companion, exploded in the overcrowded, unsanitary camps. Cholera, typhus, dysentery, these scourges ravaged the ranks with devastating speed. Medical services, overwhelmed and under-resourced, struggled desperately to stem the tide of sickness. Field hospitals overflowed. The moans of the dying filled the bitter air. For many soldiers, death came not from enemy bullets, but from the merciless winter itself. Leadership, too, faltered under the weight of the crisis. Commanders faced criticism from the ranks and from home as news of the suffering leaked out. The famed Lord Raglan, once seen as a pillar of strength, was criticized for his indecisiveness and failure to address the supply and sanitary crises adequately. Political pressures back in London and Paris added to the turmoil, as governments demanded results while the human costs soared. Morale plummeted. Letters from the front spoke of despair and hopelessness. Soldiers whispered fears of never seeing home again. Desertion and illness sapped the fighting strength of the armies. The spirit of camaraderie, though resilient, was strained by hunger, cold, and death. Yet, amidst the bleakness, moments of courage and compassion endured. Officers and medics worked tirelessly, often at great personal risk, to aid the wounded and maintain order. Local populations offered what aid they could, sharing scarce food or warm shelter. The resolve to persevere, even in the face of near-certain suffering, spoke to the depths of human endurance. The winter without mercy exposed the dark underbelly of 19th-century warfare, the failures of logistics, the vulnerability of soldiers to nature's fury, and the limits of leadership under extreme conditions. It was a crucible that tested alliances, strategies, and the very will to fight as spring slowly approached. The armies that emerged from the frozen nightmare were changed, physically weakened, emotionally scarred, but still determined. The siege of Sevastopol, far from broken, continued. The war would drag on, its cost mounting. The brutal winter of 1854–55 stood as a grim testament to the unforgiving realities of war, where nature and human frailty combined to inflict suffering on a scale rivaling any battlefield. It was a chapter of loss and endurance, a winter without mercy that left its mark on all who endured it and shaped the course of the Crimean conflict. Chapter 17. The Lady with the Lamp. In the midst of the darkness and despair that enveloped the Crimean War, as the bitter winter of 1854 to 55 claimed thousands of lives and hope seemed all but extinguished, a singular figure emerged, a beacon of light and compassion whose name would echo through history. Florence Nightingale, soon to be known as the Lady with the Lamp, arrived on the battlefield to change not only the fate of the wounded but the very face of war medicine. The conditions she found were harrowing beyond imagination. Hospitals were overcrowded, filthy, and woefully inadequate. Soldiers languished in squalid wards, suffering from wounds, infections, and disease that ravaged the ranks far more than bullets and bayonets. Sanitation was non-existent, drainage was poor, food was often scarce or spoiled. Mortality rates soared, and despair permeated every corner of the military hospitals. Nightingale, a woman of fierce determination and unwavering faith in the power of care, was not deterred by the scale of suffering. With a small team of nurses and volunteers, she set about transforming the chaotic and grim infirmaries into places of relative order, cleanliness, and hope. Her approach combined rigorous hygiene, careful organization, and compassionate care, principles that were revolutionary at the time. By implementing measures such as improved ventilation, proper disposal of waste, and sterilization of medical instruments, she dramatically reduced the spread of infection. She reorganized kitchens and laundry services to ensure patients received nourishing food and clean linens. These seemingly simple changes saved countless lives and set new standards for military and civilian nursing worldwide. But Nightingale's impact extended beyond mere logistics. She brought a humanizing presence to the suffering, her quiet visits through the wards, the soft glow of her lamp as she tended the wounded during long nights, inspired hope among soldiers who felt abandoned. She became a symbol of compassion amid the brutality of war, reminding all that behind the uniforms were men deserving dignity and care. Her influence reached beyond the hospitals. Nightingale meticulously gathered data on mortality rates and conditions, using statistics to advocate for reforms in military medical services. Her reports reached the highest levels of British government, prompting inquiries and changes that would improve the health and welfare of soldiers in future conflicts. The story of Florence Nightingale in Crimea is not just one of one woman's courage, it is a story of transformation. She challenged long-standing attitudes toward medicine, military hierarchy, and the role of women in public life. She proved that systematic care, rooted in science and compassion, could change the course of suffering in war. Her legacy was felt immediately. Mortality rates in the hospitals she oversaw dropped dramatically. Soldiers who might have died from preventable infections survived to return home. The standards she set endured beyond the Crimean War, influencing nursing and public health reforms around the world. But her journey was not without challenges. Nightingale faced resistance from military officials, cultural prejudices, and the sheer enormity of the task. Yet her resolve never faltered. Her tireless work, often in the darkest hours, illuminated a path forward in the midst of conflict and chaos. The Lady with the Lamp became a legend, not because of battlefield heroics or military victories, but because of the profound impact she had on the human side of war. Her compassion, intellect, and courage saved lives and changed history. As the Crimean War trudged on, her presence offered a glimmer of hope, a reminder that even amid the horrors of war, humanity could endure and even triumph. Florence Nightingale's story is a testament to the power of care, resilience, and the indomitable spirit of one who dared to bring light into the darkest of places. Chapter 18. Voices from the Front. The Crimean War was more than just a clash of empires and armies. It was the first modern conflict fought under the unblinking gaze of a growing public hungry for news and images. For the first time in history, war correspondents and photographers brought the grim realities of the Crimean front directly into the parlors and drawing rooms of Britain. Their voices and images transformed distant battles into vivid narratives, shaping public opinion and forever changing how war was understood by those far from the battlefield. In the mid-19th century, newspapers were becoming powerful vehicles of information and influence. The appetite for timely, accurate, and compelling news was growing rapidly, fueled by rising literacy rates and expanding urban populations. Into this landscape stepped a new breed of men, war correspondents, whose mission was to report directly from the front lines, to tell the story of the soldiers and the battles as they unfolded. William Howard Russell, the pioneering correspondent for the Times, was among the first to send dispatches from the Crimea. His reports were stark and unvarnished, painting a picture of courage and suffering that shocked the British public. Unlike the sanitized accounts of official military communiques, Russell's writing revealed the logistical failures, the harsh conditions, and the human cost of the war with brutal honesty. Russell described the muddy trenches, the inadequate supplies, and the rampant disease that plagued the camps. He chronicled the stories of individual soldiers, their bravery, their despair, their longing for home. His words carried a weight and immediacy that made distant battles feel close and urgent. Alongside the written word, a new technology emerged to capture the war: photography. Roger Fenton, commissioned by the British government, arrived in Crimea armed with a bulky camera and an even more ambitious purpose: to record the war through images. The process was arduous, requiring long exposures and heavy equipment transported over difficult terrain. Yet, Fenton persevered, producing some of the earliest war photographs ever taken. His photographs showed the landscape scarred by battle, the camps where soldiers lived and died, and the aftermath of fighting. Notably, Fenton avoided graphic depictions of the wounded or dead, reflecting the sensibilities of the time, but his images still conveyed the harshness and reality of the conflict. Together, the correspondents' words and the photographers' images brought the Crimean War into British homes in a way that had never been done before. Readers could imagine the cold winds biting at soldiers' faces, hear the thunder of cannon fire, and see the desolation of a war-torn land. The distance between front and home shrank. The impact was profound. Public awareness and concern grew, leading to increased pressure on political and military leaders to address the failures exposed in the reporting. Scandals about inadequate medical care, poor supply management, and leadership incompetence reached the halls of government. The public demanded reform. The power of media coverage also humanized the soldiers, transforming faceless troops into individuals with stories and sacrifices. Fundraising campaigns were launched, and volunteer organizations, inspired in part by the reports, mobilized to support the troops. Yet, the role of correspondents and photographers was not without controversy. Their presence sometimes complicated military operations, and their depictions occasionally clashed with official narratives. The tension between truth-telling and propaganda became a defining feature of modern war reporting. The Crimean War, thus, marked a turning point, the beginning of what we now recognize as war journalism. It set standards and raised questions about the ethics of reporting, the responsibilities of governments to their citizens, and the relationship between the battlefield and the home front, i.e. the voices from the front, the ordinary and the extraordinary, converged. Stories of heroism and horror, strategy and failure, endurance and loss. They gave the public a window into the realities of war, unfiltered and immediate, and forever changed how conflict would be viewed and remembered. As the cannons roared across the Crimean landscape, it was not only the sound of battle, but the echo of those voices and images that carried beyond the front lines, shaping history, informing generations, and ensuring that the sacrifices of the Crimean War would never be forgotten. Chapter 19. Allies and Discord. The guns of Sevastopol thundered day and night. The trenches deepened. The graves multiplied. But as the Crimean War dragged into its most grinding and gruesome phase, a different kind of battle began to rage. Not on the muddy fields of Crimea, but within the minds, tempers, and pride of those meant to lead. Allies in name, Britain and France found themselves entangled in a struggle of egos, mistrust, and miscommunication, one that threatened to unravel the very alliance that had brought them together against a common enemy. The idea of a joint campaign, coordinated between nations with different languages, cultures, command structures, and political interests, was never going to be easy. But as the siege of Sevastopol entered its long, bitter middle stage, the cracks widened. At the heart of the problem stood two towering yet flawed figures: Lord Raglan, commander of the British forces, and General François Canrobert, his French counterpart. Both men wore the polished armor of reputation, but beneath that shine lay nerves fraying under the weight of attrition, illness, and constant pressure from distant capitals demanding swift results. Lord Raglan, aging and increasingly isolated, was a man of old-school nobility and tradition. A veteran of Waterloo, he carried himself with dignity and caution. Yet that caution, in the mud and filth of Crimea, often appeared as indecision. Canrobert, a younger and more politically entangled figure, was under intense scrutiny from Paris, and his orders came not only from the battlefield, but from the ambitions of Napoleon III, who viewed the war as both a proving ground and a platform for glory. What united them, at first, was necessity. What divided them, as the war ground on, was everything else. At headquarters, planning sessions became strained affairs. Language barriers added to the confusion. French aides misunderstood British directives. British staff grew frustrated with Gallic formality. But more than language, it was tone and intention that caused friction. Raglan, slow to commit, favored deliberation over daring. Canrobert, eager to impress and pressured by the emperor's gaze, wanted bold action. Neither trusted the other fully. Each suspected hesitation or recklessness in the other's strategies that in one critical moment, plans for a coordinated assault on Sevastopol unraveled in the space of hours. Orders were delayed. Troops advanced at different times. Artillery preparation was mistimed. The result was confusion, heavy casualties, and no gain. Fingers pointed. Memos flew. And behind closed doors, frustration turned into quiet contempt. Even worse, the soldiers felt it. In the camps, grumblings began, of being sacrificed to incompetence, of dying because generals could not agree. French soldiers, already strained by poor logistics, blamed British arrogance. British troops muttered about French vanity and rashness. These were not mere rumors. They reflected real tensions on the ground. The illusion of unity was cracking, and all the while, the Russians watched and waited. To the east of the Allied lines, the defenders of Sevastopol, battered but unbroken, gained precious time. Every delay, every failed offensive allowed Russian engineers to repair defenses, dig deeper trenches, and prepare for renewed fighting. Allied discord was not just a political embarrassment. It was a gift to the enemy. The situation reached a critical point when Canrobert, wearied by internal conflict and political pressure, resigned his command in May 1855. His replacement, General Pelissier, was a sterner, colder man, less inclined to compromise and far more determined to assert French dominance. Though more effective militarily, his arrival did little to ease tensions. Raglan, now physically and mentally declining, found himself increasingly sidelined. Communication grew terse. Collaboration became minimal. Each nation began planning and acting with less regard for the other. Raglan would not live to see the siege's end. On June 28, 1855, worn by the strain of command and the bitterness of isolation, he died, not from wounds, but from disease and exhaustion. His death marked more than the end of a career. It symbolized the toll that miscommunication, rivalry, and indecision had taken on the Allied effort. Back home, the public in both Britain and France had little understanding of these internal conflicts. They saw victories delayed and soldiers suffering. They read reports of missteps, but did not always grasp the causes. Yet within government halls, the friction between allies became a matter of serious concern. Diplomats worked tirelessly behind the scenes to patch over military discord, to remind commanders that the war was not about pride, but purpose. Despite the dysfunction, the alliance held. Not because of harmony, but because failure was not an option. The fall of Sevastopol remained the goal, and as summer returned to the peninsula, so too did a renewed determination, born not of unity, but of sheer necessity. The lesson was not lost. The Crimean War had shown that even among allies, War was a storm of personalities as much as of steel and fire. That commanders could be undone not by the enemy's guns, but by the silence between tents. That an alliance, no matter how noble its intent, must be constantly defended, not just against the enemy across the trenches, but against the egos within. In the end, the British and French would take Sevastopol. But the road there had been longer, bloodier, and more bitter than it needed to be. And in every shell that missed its mark, every attack that faltered, every soldier buried because orders were late or wrong, there echoed the cost of discord. Allies they remained. But never again would Britain and France march into war together with such naivete. The experience in Crimea had been a harsh tutor. It had taught them that even shared purpose cannot always tame pride, and that victory, when forged in such friction, comes at a price written not only in blood, but in trust. Chapter 20. The Sardinian Wildcard. As the cannons thundered across the Crimean hills and the great powers of Europe bled into the muddy trenches outside Sevastopol, a new player stepped cautiously into the theater of war. It was not a giant, nor a colossus of men or wealth, but a small kingdom nestled in the mountains and plains of northern Italy. The Kingdom of Sardinia, a name rarely uttered in the same breath as Britain, France, or Russia, suddenly cast its lot with the Allied cause. It was a move that, at first glance, seemed curious, even reckless. But beneath its modest flag flew the ambitions of a nation that dared to reshape its future by stepping into the crucible of history. In early 1855, while the great Allied armies suffered under snow, disease, and deadlock, Count Camillo di Cavour, the shrewd and calculating Prime Minister of Sardinia, made his move. He proposed that his kingdom, though modest in size, would send troops to support the Anglo-French alliance against Russia. It was not a decision born of idealism or desperation. It was a calculated gamble. Sardinia had no pressing quarrel with Russia, no immediate stake in Crimea. But what it did have was a dream. The dream of uniting the fragmented Italian states into a single nation, of freeing itself from Austrian dominance, of rising from obscurity to claim a seat at the table of European power. For Cavour, the Crimean War was not just a battlefield, it was a stage. By aligning with Britain and France, Sardinia could gain diplomatic favor, elevate its prestige, and, most importantly, ensure that the great powers would listen when the question of Italy's future arose. War was a terrible cost to pay for recognition, but it was the currency of influence in the mid-19th century. King Victor Emmanuel II, the Sardinian monarch, endorsed the plan. And in the spring of 1855, an expeditionary force of approximately 15,000 Sardinian soldiers, under the command of General Alfonso La Marmora, set sail for the Black Sea. Clad in smart uniforms and driven by a mission that exceeded mere territory, they disembarked with pride, men of a small kingdom marching into a great war. Their arrival was met with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. The British, grumbling in their tents, saw little use for these newcomers. The French, already stretched thin and wary of managing another partner, offered formal courtesy but little enthusiasm. Yet the Sardinians, well-drilled and well-equipped, made a quiet impression. They adapted quickly, constructed their camps with discipline, and prepared for combat with the seriousness of those who knew that their every action was being weighed and judged. Their first real test came not in the trenches of Sevastopol but in the valley of the Crimea River on August 16, 1855. The Russians, hoping to break the siege with a sudden strike, launched a fierce assault across the river, straight into the positions defended by Sardinian and French troops. What followed was a maelstrom of musket fire, cannon smoke, and hand-to-hand combat. And in that chaos, the Sardinians stood firm. They repelled the Russian assault with valor and tenacity. Their lines did not break. Their discipline did not falter. The French, watching from adjacent positions, took note. The British, reading reports afterward, were forced to admit the Sardinian Wildcard had played its hand well. The Battle of the Crimea was a relatively small engagement in the context of the broader war, but for Sardinia, it was a moment of profound significance. It proved that its army could stand alongside the great powers, that it could bleed and fight for a cause not strictly its own, and, more crucially, that its sacrifice could not be ignored. Cavour, back in Turin, understood the power of that symbolism. He maneuvered with the same precision and diplomacy that La Marmora had shown on the battlefield. At the Congress of Paris in 1856, where the victors gathered to shape the post-war order, Sardinia, thanks to its contribution in Crimea, was invited to the table. And when Cavour spoke, he did not limit his words to the terms of the peace. He raised the issue of Italian unification. He denounced the Austrian occupation of Lombardy and Venetia. He made the case that Italy, fractured and smothered for too long, deserved a place in the new Europe. It was not a dramatic speech. It did not alter borders overnight, but it planted a seed that would, within a decade, blossom into the Risorgimento, the unification of Italy. The Crimean War, for all its blood and misery, had become the unlikely launchpad of an Italian revolution, not on the battlefield, but in the courtrooms of power. Sardinia's involvement was brief, its casualties fewer than those of Britain or France, but its political gains were immense. It had gambled its sons for influence, and won. The war had forged new alliances, tested old ones, and redrawn more than maps. It had rewritten destinies in the years to come. The Sardinian kingdom, bolstered by its newfound stature, would wage war against Austria, rally the Italian states, and eventually proclaim the birth of a united Italy under the House of Savoy. The soldiers who had stood in the mud of Crimea would return to a homeland that no longer saw itself as small or peripheral. They had marched for honor, but they had returned as the architects of a nation. In the quiet moments between battles, as snow fell on the Crimean plains and the world seemed paused in agony, no one could have imagined that a small detachment from a distant corner of Europe would reshape its future on those very shores. But history, like war, is full of surprises. The Sardinian Wildcard had been played, not with noise, but with strategy, not for territory, but for destiny. And in the end, it was not just Sevastopol that fell. It was the old belief that only the great powers could shape the world. Sardinia had stepped into the fire and emerged with a voice. Chapter 21. The Malakoff and the Redan. By the summer of 1855, the siege of Sevastopol had dragged on for nearly a year. The once proud fortress city, perched on the edge of the Black Sea, had become a shattered labyrinth of craters, trenches, and fire-blackened ruins. Smoke curled from its rooftops. Shells fell without pause. The thunder of artillery was as constant as the wind. And yet, the Russian defenders endured. Day after day, night after night, they fought on, grim, determined, and unyielding for the Allies, who had come so far and paid such a terrible price. This resilience was maddening. The British and French, camped in the mud and rot outside the city, had thrown men and metal against its walls for months. They had endured winter, disease, hunger, and internal discord. They had seen victories lost to hesitation and heroism drowned in blood. Now, they wanted an end. Not another maneuver. Not another quiet raid in the night. They wanted a final blow. A storm, a reckoning. Something decisive. At the heart of Sevastopol's defenses stood two fortresses that had become legendary. The Malakoff and the Great Redan. The Malakoff Tower, manned by Russian troops under General Todlebin's engineering genius, commanded the southeastern approach to the city. It was a bastion of stone, earthworks, and iron will, bristling with cannon, crisscrossed with trenches, and fortified by months of relentless labor. To take it would be to break Sevastopol's spine. The Great Redan lay just west of the Malakoff, a sprawling network of ramparts and rifle pits, steeped in barbed wire and gunfire. It guarded the southern edge of the Russian line and was just as formidable. Together, these strongholds were the twin hearts of Russian resistance. On the morning of September 8, 1855, under a gray and unforgiving sky, the final assault began. The French, led by General McMahon, were tasked with taking the Malakoff. Their preparations had been painstaking. Tunnels had been dug. Sappers had inched forward under enemy fire for weeks. Artillery batteries had pounded the Malakoff's defenses day and night. Now, after weeks of bombardment, the time had come. The signal was given at dawn. Bugles rang out across the ravines, and columns of French infantry surged forward through the smoke and rubble. They were met with a fury beyond imagining. Russian gunners, ready and waiting, unleashed a storm of grapeshot and shell. The air turned black with smoke and fire. Men screamed, fell, rose again, and pressed on. They charged uphill, bayonets gleaming, their uniforms torn and soaked in blood. Wave after wave came. And in that hell, amid fire and steel, the French reached the walls. They fought hand to hand with the defenders, Russians wielding rifles, bayonets, and even shovels, desperate to hold the line. Blood slicked the stones. The cries of the wounded drowned in the roar of cannon fire. The French surged over the ramparts. And then, they held. For the first time in nearly a year, one of Sevastopol's great bastions had fallen. The tricolor flew over the Malakoff, but victory was not yet certain. To the west, the British were tasked with taking the great Redan. Their path was longer, more exposed. Their objective was just as vital. Led by Sir James Simpson, the British launched their assault shortly after the French began theirs. The men of the 1st, 4th, and Light Divisions surged forward through no man's land, over ground shattered by months of bombardment, under the burning sun and Russian fire. But where the French had surprise, the British had miscommunication. Their artillery preparation had been insufficient. Their formations broke under withering fire before they even reached the Russian lines. Officers fell. Troops stumbled. The Redan, like a monster in the smoke, loomed ahead, impossible to see, impossible to reach, and still they charged. Some reached the ditch. A few climbed the parapets. For a moment, it seemed the Redan might fall, but the Russians, emboldened by their hatred and the knowledge that this was the final fight, counterattacked with ferocity. They swept the ramparts with musket fire. They hurled grenades into the British ranks. And one by one, the attackers were driven back. What had been hope became chaos. The retreat was slow, bloody, and confused. Wounded men cried out. Officers tried to rally their troops. But the ground was slick with death. When the sun dipped behind the ruins, the French still held the Malakoff. The British had failed to take the Redan. The price had been immense. And yet, the fall of the Malakoff was enough. Without the Malakoff, Sevastopol could not stand. That night, as darkness swallowed the wreckage, the Russians made their decision. They withdrew, not in surrender, but in silence. Chapter 22, Fall of the Fortress, September 1855. The guns had roared for nearly a year. The sky above Sevastopol was rarely clear, shrouded in smoke, lit by flame, broken by the scream of artillery. The Black Sea winds carried the stench of gunpowder, sweat, and death across the trenches. And yet, the city had endured. For 349 long days, the Russians held their ground. Every street, every bastion, every stone soaked in blood and defiance. But on the night of September 8th, something shifted. Something ancient in its finality. The fortress cracked. The fall of Sevastopol was not a sudden collapse, nor a triumphant storming of the walls. It was the slow surrender of a city whose bones had been broken piece by piece. The Allies, British, French, Sardinian, and Ottoman, had worn down the stone with steel and flame. Each trench dug closer, each bombardment heavier, each assault more determined than the last. And when the French took the Malakoff redoubt in a brutal crescendo of fire and flesh, the soul of Sevastopol broke. That night, under a moonless sky, the Russians began their retreat. There were no trumpet blasts, no banners torn down in surrender, just the silence of men leaving behind the ruins of a year-long stand. Soldiers filed across floating bridges, makeshift paths across the harbor, to the north side of the city, carrying with them only what they could bear. Wounded comrades were left behind. Guns were spiked or hurled into the sea. Ammunition stores, those that could not be salvaged, were rigged to explode. And then, in the deep hours of night, fire consumed the southern half of Sevastopol. Explosions tore through the naval docks as the Russians ignited their magazines. The city shook with a terrible finality. Flames reached into the sky. Stone walls collapsed inward. The great ships of the Black Sea Fleet, symbols of imperial might, were scuttled and burned, their hulks swallowed by black water. A funeral pyre for an empire's ambition. From their trenches, the Allies watched in stunned silence. The fires lit up their exhausted faces. There was no cheering, no celebration, only the terrible understanding that this was the end, and that the cost had been near unbearable. The morning light on September 9th revealed what war had wrought. Sevastopol, once the pride of Russian fortification, was now a smoldering graveyard. Rubble choked its streets. Bodies lay in heaps. Cannons, twisted and shattered, jutted from craters like broken teeth. The silence of victory was heavier than any battle cry. French troops, first into the southern city, raised their flag over the Malakoff. British soldiers followed into the ruins of the Redan. There was no resistance, only the ghosts of the fallen. The siege, the bloodiest and most relentless chapter of the war, was over, but even as the smoke cleared, there was no clear triumph. The Allies had taken the fortress, yes, but it had come at a cost so staggering that the very meaning of victory felt hollow. Tens of thousands had died. From bullets, from bayonets, from disease and cold. Entire battalions were reduced to shadows of their former strength. The dead lay not just in the city but in the souls of those who survived. Men who had come with dreams of glory now limped through the rubble, dragging shattered limbs and haunted stairs. And for Russia, the fall of Sevastopol was not just a military defeat. It was a psychological one that Tsar Alexander II, newly crowned, after the death of his father Nicholas, received the news with a cold, grim resolve. The fortress had been his father's obsession, the symbol of Russian pride on the Black Sea. Its loss was not only strategic, but deeply symbolic. The empire had been humbled, not crushed, but wounded. The myth of Russian invincibility, born from centuries of expansion and war, had met its match in the mud and fire of Crimea. Across Europe, the fall sent shockwaves. In Paris and London, the public greeted the news with mixed emotions. Relief, yes, but also horror. The war had dragged on too long, claimed too many lives, and shown too many cracks in leadership and strategy. The victory, such as it was, offered no clean ending, only exhaustion. And in the Ottoman Empire, the fall of Sevastopol was seen as vindication, but not without anxiety. They had been saved, yes, but only by the intervention of the West. The cost of that salvation, in pride and autonomy, would linger long after the last cannon fell silent. But within the ruins, something else stirred, something quieter, yet no less powerful. Hope. In the shattered hospitals, nurses like Florence Nightingale continued to tend to the wounded, rewriting the future of medicine through compassion and science. In the rubble, engineers and generals took notes, understanding that the war had revealed new truths about modern siege warfare, logistics, and the terrible efficiency of prolonged combat. And in the halls of power, diplomats began to speak not of fresh offensives, but of peace, because the fall of Sevastopol, while not the final chapter, marked the turning point. The Russian army, though not defeated in the field, had been dealt a blow it could not ignore. The Allied powers, battered and strained, saw that pressing forward would cost more lives than they could bear. The fortress had fallen, and with it, the will to continue this war unchecked. Peace was not yet signed, but its shadow stretched long across the scorched earth of Crimea. And as the fires of Sevastopol dimmed, a new light, faint, flickering, began to rise on the horizon. In the months that followed the fall, life in the remains of Sevastopol settled into a strange quiet, the kind that only follows after unrelenting chaos. The surviving Russian garrison, now stationed on the northern heights across the harbor, watched helplessly as their southern half, the city they had sworn to defend, remained in enemy hands. They had not surrendered, not formally, but they no longer controlled the field. The psychological toll of that distinction was immense. The Allies held their ground, but their victory offered little cause for celebration. Disease still stalked the camps. The wounded outnumbered the healthy. Letters sent home spoke less of glory and more of weariness, the kind that soaked into bone and never left. Every ruined street of Sevastopol bore witness to that fatigue. The dead still lay buried beneath collapsed buildings. The sea still lapped at the harbor where proud ships once sailed. The war had become a ghost that walked with every man who had survived it. In Paris, Napoleon III seized the moment to cast himself as a victor and a man of peace. The war had enhanced his standing on the world stage, but he knew that it could not continue without unacceptable cost. In London, public opinion, once bloodthirsty and proud, had shifted. The death toll, the leadership failures, the endless dispatches describing frostbite, cholera, and battlefield confusion had broken the illusion of a clean, noble war. There was pressure now, from the people, from Parliament, from the bleeding edge of reality. And in St. Petersburg, Tsar Alexander II, less autocratic than his father, more pragmatic, began to listen to voices that had long been ignored. Voices calling for reform, for restraint, for survival. He could not reclaim Sevastopol, but he could stop the bleeding. The empire, vast and still powerful, had nothing more to gain from this war. Only more sons to lose. The diplomacy that followed was slow but determined. In the early months of 1856, all sides began to circle the idea of a settlement, a ceasefire, a way out. And so, from the wreckage of Sevastopol, a new dialogue emerged, not from trust, but from exhaustion. By March 1856, peace negotiations were underway in Paris. The French capital, elegant and removed from the blood and mud, became the setting for the war's final chapter. Diplomats from all belligerents, Russia, France, Britain, the Ottoman Empire, and Sardinia, gathered to draft the terms. The fall of Sevastopol hung over the room like a ghost. Russia agreed to demilitarize the Black Sea, a staggering concession, one that stripped her of naval presence and humbled her strategic ambitions. The Danubian principalities were returned to Ottoman control under European supervision. Neutrality of the Black Sea was guaranteed. And the balance of power, that fragile, ever-shifting axis on which European politics turned, was, for the moment, restored. The Treaty of Paris was signed on March 30th, 1856. And so, the Crimean War, one of the bloodiest and most mismanaged conflicts of the 19th century, came to an end. But the fall of Sevastopol was not merely a military moment. It was a fracture in the old world that revealed the brutal reality of modern warfare, of sieges fought with industrial age precision and inefficiency, of soldiers dying less from bullets and more from infection and frost. It exposed the cracks in empires, the fragility of alliances, and the terrible price of it also birthed change. Florence Nightingale's tireless work led to a revolution in military medicine. The failures of logistics, communication, and coordination sparked reforms in both the British and French armies. The Russian defeat forced introspection. Reforms would follow, including the emancipation of the serfs just 5 years later. And, for Italy, Sardinia's presence at the peace talks gave momentum to its unification movement, setting a course that would reshape Europe within a decade. That Sevastopol's fall, then, was not an ending. It was an awakening, and as the last cannons cooled, as the banners were folded, as the ships returned home, the world stood changed forever. Chapter 23. Russia in Retreat. The smoke had barely cleared over the scorched ruins of Sevastopol when the truth, long resisted, finally took shape in the minds of Russian generals, ministers, and the young Tsar himself. This war, this bitter gamble waged in the name of faith, empire, and pride, it could not be won. Not now. Not after so many dead. Not with the Black Sea fleet at the bottom of the harbor and Sevastopol's bastions reduced to ash and silence. Russia, vast, sprawling, and feared, had been brought to its knees. Retreat, in the Russian mind, had never come easily. From the snows of Napoleon's invasion to the sieges of the East, the empire had survived countless storms by endurance alone. But this war had changed the rules. This was not a matter of waiting out the enemy. It was a matter of surviving their fire, across the frozen steppes and wind-swept battlefields, the scale of the cost became impossible to ignore. Over 500,000 Russian soldiers had taken part in the Crimean campaign. Of those, more than 400,000 would never return home, killed not only in battle but by disease, exposure, starvation, and bureaucratic incompetence. The Tsarist army, stretched thin across 1,000 miles of frontier, could no longer sustain the fight. Morale among the troops had collapsed. Ammunition was short. Horses had died in the snow. Men fought with torn boots and empty bellies. It was not just the body of the army that was broken. It was the soul that in the capital, St. Petersburg, the mood had soured into something dangerous. Nicholas I, the Iron Tsar who had once declared himself Europe's gendarme, had died in March 1855, his heart heavy with the shame of failure. Whether it was pneumonia, grief, or guilt that finally took him, no one could say for certain. But to many in his court, he died with a war unfinished and a legacy in doubt. His son, Alexander II, had inherited more than a throne. He inherited a nation on fire. He was not his father. Less rigid, more thoughtful, more aware of the shifting world around him. He had seen firsthand the cost of blind imperial ambition. And now he faced a choice. Continue a war Russia could no longer afford, or find a way out, even if it meant swallowing pride and conceding ground. The calculus was cold and clear. The Black Sea Fleet, once a tool of projection and prestige, was gone. Its remains rotted beneath the waves. Russian supply lines, battered by distance and mud, had failed time and again to sustain frontline operations. New threats stirred in the north and east. Domestic unrest simmered. Even the bureaucracy groaned under the weight of incompetence and corruption. Meanwhile, Britain and France, though weary, remained determined. Their own losses had been staggering. Yet unlike Russia, they had resources to spare. Industrial might, global navies, colonial income. And though their publics were increasingly war-weary, their governments still held the upper hand. On the battlefield and at the negotiating table, worse still for Russia, Austria, once a potential ally, had turned its back. Though the Austrians had never joined the fighting, their political maneuvering had isolated Russia diplomatically. The Danubian principalities, previously under loose Ottoman control, had been occupied by Austria early in the conflict. Now, their future lay in limbo. Russia, once a power among many, now found itself nearly alone. It was not defeat that forced Russia to the table. It was isolation. And so, in early 1856, as snow continued to fall across Crimea, Tsar Alexander II authorized his diplomats to negotiate terms. It was not a surrender. Russia would not bow, not openly. But it was a retreat, a withdrawal from the ambitions that had lit the first spark of war. The dream of dominating the Ottoman Empire, of controlling the Black Sea, of speaking for Orthodox Christians across the Balkans, all of it was shelved, if not abandoned outright. In Paris, the negotiations began. Chapter 24. The Treaty of Paris. The cannons had finally fallen silent. The last embers of Sevastopol's ruin glowed dim beneath the gray skies of early 1856. Across Europe, the thunder of war that had echoed from the Black Sea to the Danube began to fade, replaced by the soft rustle of papers and the measured voices of statesmen. Peace, elusive, overdue, and fragile, had come not by conquest, but through exhaustion. The Crimean War had burned brightly. Now came the in March 1856. Representatives from 7 nations gathered in Paris, not to celebrate victory, but to settle the ruins. Diplomats from France, Britain, the Ottoman Empire, Sardinia, Austria, Prussia, and a humbled Russia filed into the elegant halls of the Quai d'Orsay. Marble columns, golden chandeliers, and the perfume of French courtly formality masked the true stakes of what was to be decided. Empires hung in the balance. So did reputations, ambitions, and the long-term shape of Europe. The host, Napoleon III, was no stranger to spectacle. He saw the Congress not only as an opportunity to shape the peace, but to burnish his own legacy. France had bled for its position in Europe, and now he meant to cash in. His diplomats, polished and calculating, moved with the confidence of a nation that had stood on the winning side, if not at the front, then certainly on the hill when the smoke cleared. Across the table, Russia's delegation was quiet, stern. They came not to posture, but to salvage. Prince Orlov and Count Alexei Bol brought with them more than their government's consent. They carried the bruises of Sevastopol, the bitterness of isolation, and the knowledge that their empire had been humbled, not beaten, but undeniably changed up. Britain's team, cautious and blunt, focused less on glory and more on structure. The war had revealed cracks in their own system, failures in supply, command, and vision, and while they emerged with victory, it was a victory tempered by reflection. Their interest now lay in preserving the balance of power and curbing Russian ambition without redrawing too many maps. For the Ottomans, the stakes were nothing less than survival. They had emerged from the war with their empire intact, thanks only to the arms of their allies. Their dignity, however, was another matter. And for Sardinia, the smallest power at the table, the stakes were not in Crimea, but in the future of Italy. Prime Minister Cavour, master of subtlety and strategy, was playing a longer game, one that reached beyond the treaty and into the soul of the Italian peninsula. The negotiations began with courtesies, speeches, toasts, gestures of civility that masked the raw edges beneath. But quickly, substance overtook ceremony. The first and most pressing matter was the Black Sea. For centuries, Russia had eyed it as a stepping stone to the Mediterranean, a theater of influence and ambition. Now, that ambition would be stripped. The Treaty of Paris would declare the Black Sea neutral. No warships, no fortifications, no naval arsenals. The great fleets of Russia would not return, nor would any other power be allowed to dominate those waters again. To the Russian delegation, it was a bitter pill. Their pride, their history, their sacrifice, all now shackled by foreign ink. But they signed. There was no alternative. Next came the Danubian principalities, Moldavia and Wallachia. Their future had been one of the sparks that lit the war. Russia's influence there had been growing, threatening to tip the balance in southeastern Europe. The treaty now placed them under nominal Ottoman suzerainty, but with guarantees of autonomy, and with their independence monitored by all the great powers. It was a diplomatic sleight of hand. The Ottomans retained sovereignty, but no single empire, least of all Russia, could dominate them again. Then came the holy places that it had been, after all, a quarrel over keys and candles in Jerusalem that had helped ignite this fire. Now, at last, the terms were made clear. Catholic and Orthodox rights in the Holy Land would be jointly respected, a fragile peace brokered more by weariness than trust. The Ottoman Sultan would remain custodian of the Christian sites, promising access and fairness. But the ghosts of that quarrel would never fully disappear. Asterisk as the details fell into place, the ink began to dry. But between every word written on parchment, there was blood, silent, invisible, but present in every line. The war had taken hundreds of thousands of lives. It had leveled cities. It had changed empires. And now, peace came not with jubilation, but with a long, exhausted sigh. One of the most curious presences in the Paris Conference was the Kingdom of Sardinia. A minor military player, yes, but politically, Sardinia's prime minister, Count Camillo di Cavour, maneuvered through the diplomatic crowd like a man twice his nation's size. He had not joined the war for Crimea. He had joined it for Italy. By siding with Britain and France, Sardinia had earned a seat at the table, and in doing so, forced the European powers to recognize the Italian question. Cavour did not demand territory or treaties. He planted seeds, conversations, alliances, attention. The Crimean War had bought Sardinia more than peace. It had bought credibility. Within a decade, Italy would begin to unify. And it all began here, in the salons of Paris, under the shadow of a treaty written in the ashes of Sevastopol. Elsewhere, Austria, which had stayed officially neutral but leaned heavily toward the Allies, found itself mistrusted by all. Russia, once a distant ally, now regarded Vienna with cold disdain. The Western powers, though grateful for Austrian pressure on the Russian flank, questioned its reliability. In trying to preserve the balance of power without firing a shot, Austria had succeeded only in isolating itself. It would pay the price in the years to come. When the Treaty of Paris was finally signed on March 30th, 1856, the formalities echoed with solemnity. Russia agreed to return captured Ottoman territory. The Black Sea would remain neutral, closed to warships. The Danube River, lifeblood of Eastern Europe, was declared open to all commerce, internationalized and protected. The integrity of the Ottoman Empire was formally guaranteed by all the major powers, a promise more symbolic than real, yet vital to the illusion of European stability. And so, with a signature and a seal, the Crimean War officially ended, but its echoes were far from silent. Russia had not been defeated on the battlefield in a final blow, but it had been broken strategically. Its military weakness exposed, its diplomatic isolation confirmed, and its pride shaken. The Tsar would never again launch such a war without first rebuilding from within, reforms that would ripple into the emancipation of the serfs, modernizing the Russian military, and restructuring the bureaucracy. For Britain and France, the war was a paradox, a victory that tasted like failure. Though Sevastopol had fallen and Russia had retreated, the war had revealed deep flaws in their systems. Public outrage over the treatment of soldiers, the logistical blunders, and the lack of coordination forced changes in military practice, journalism, and medicine. The birth of modern war correspondence, field hospitals, and real-time public scrutiny all had their roots in Crimea. And for the Ottoman Empire, the so-called sick man of Europe, the treaty preserved its borders but not its autonomy. The war had been survived, not won. Propped up by European power, it now depended on Western support more than ever, a reality that would come to define the next half-century of Ottoman decline. As for the people, the men who had marched, dug, bled, and died, the treaty was little more than a quiet end to a loud ordeal. Letters went home. Graves remained unmarked. Families mourned. The war that had begun over questions of religion, pride, and power had ended not with righteousness, but with weariness. The Treaty of Paris stood as a symbol of peace, yes, but also of the growing complexity of modern war. It showed that victory no longer belonged solely to the battlefield, that diplomacy could finish what cannon fire had begun, that empire was as much about perception as possession, and above all, it showed that Europe, for all its rivalries and ambitions, was changing. The old rules of honor, of unilateral aggression, of empires unchecked, had been tested, and though they had not yet broken, they had bent. The Crimean War had bent them, and the Treaty of Paris, signed beneath crystal chandeliers and painted ceilings, would not be the last of its kind. But for a moment, just a moment, it brought silence, and sometimes silence is the only kind of victory anyone can afford. Chapter 26. Echoes of Crimea. The guns of the Crimean War had fallen silent for decades, yet their echoes continued to reverberate across continents, empires, and generations. The conflict, fought between 1853 and 1856, was not merely a clash of armies on distant shores. It was a watershed moment that reshaped the destinies of nations, exposed deep fractures in old powers, and set the stage for the cataclysms that would follow. For Russia, the war was a harsh awakening. The staggering losses, both in men and prestige, exposed the empire's weaknesses with brutal clarity. The vastness of the land and the old feudal structures that underpinned it could not compensate for an outdated military and a society resistant to change. Sevastopol's fall and the restrictions imposed by the Treaty of Paris struck at the heart of Russian pride and ambition. But from this crucible of defeat arose a determination to reform, to modernize, to rebuild, to catch up with the industrialized West. Tsar Alexander II, who ascended the throne amid the turmoil, understood this truth. His reign marked an era of profound transformation. The most dramatic and far-reaching of his reforms was the emancipation of the serfs in 1861, freeing millions from centuries of bondage, altering the social fabric of Russia forever. This was not merely a humanitarian gesture. It was a strategic necessity. A free peasantry was essential to fuel economic modernization and to provide a more effective military manpower base. Military reforms followed swiftly. The Russian army was reorganized, conscription laws were revised, and training methods updated. New technologies were adopted, and the infrastructure for rapid troop movement improved. Though Russia would not immediately regain its dominant status, the seeds planted after Crimea allowed it to re-emerge as a major player on the European stage by the late 19th century. Yet, Russia's ambitions remained circumscribed. The Treaty of Paris's demilitarization of the Black Sea curtailed Russian naval power for decades. Only in the years leading up to World War I would Russia challenge these limitations, rebuilding its fleets and fortifications in a renewed quest for influence over the Balkans and the Ottoman territories. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire, often called the sick man of Europe even before the war, faced an agonizing decline. The war had exposed its vulnerabilities starkly. Though its territorial integrity was nominally preserved, the empire had become increasingly dependent on European powers for survival. Its military was outdated, its administration inefficient, and its population fractious. Nationalist movements within the Balkans, inspired by the tide of independence sweeping through Europe, threatened to unravel the empire from within. Reform efforts, known as the Tanzimat, aimed to modernize the Ottoman state, to secularize administration, improve education, and strengthen the army. Yet these changes were uneven and often resisted by conservative elements. The empire struggled to maintain its cohesion amid internal strife and external pressures. The Crimean War had temporarily staved off collapse, but it had also accelerated the processes that would lead to the eventual dissolution of Ottoman control over southeastern Europe. For Britain and France, the war marked a temporary assertion of influence, but also a moment of introspection. Both powers had seen the limits of their military preparedness and the costs of extended campaigns in unfamiliar terrain. The war had exposed deficiencies in command, supply, and medical care, prompting reforms and modernization efforts within their own militaries. Yet, the shifting balance of power in Europe and the growing strength of Germany and Russia would soon challenge their dominance. Perhaps the most profound legacy of the Crimean War was the reshaping of alliances and tensions that, over the following decades, would culminate in the First World War. The diplomatic alignments forged and broken in the wake of the war laid the groundwork for the complex web of alliances, rivalries, and grievances that engulfed Europe in 1914 that the Treaty of Paris had attempted to maintain a fragile peace by guaranteeing the Ottoman Empire's integrity and limiting Russian expansion. Yet, the Balkan question remained unresolved. Nationalist aspirations, imperial ambitions, and great power rivalries simmered beneath the surface, erupting repeatedly in crises and conflicts. The memory of Crimea, its battles, its sieges, its suffering, lingered in the collective consciousness of Europe. It was a reminder of both the horrors of war and the imperative of reform. Military academies studied its campaigns, political leaders debated its outcomes. The war correspondents and photographers who had brought the realities of conflict into drawing rooms had forever changed public engagement with war that on the battlefields of Crimea, the seeds of modern warfare had been sown. The railways, trenches, telegraphs, and media that had emerged in this conflict would define the wars to come. The human cost, the heroism, and the tragedy became the enduring echo, a somber refrain warning of the price of power struggles. Left unresolved, as the 19th century waned and the 20th dawned, the world bore the imprint of Crimea's lessons, in the march of armies, in the diplomacy of nations, and in the hearts of those who remembered. The echoes of Crimea would not fade quietly. They would roar into the next century, a century shaped by the ambitions, fears, and failures born on those windswept shores.